In the midst of the most violent storm of her life, Nora discovers her husband has not only betrayed her, he's selling the island's soul to criminals. Abandoned penniless on an island about to be engulfed by the storm, she must choose: beg her betrayer for mercy or stand up amidst the ruins and fight. But she doesn't know that her suitcase contains something an entire criminal empire is willing to kill for, and the only man who can save her is the most dangerous mafia boss in the Caribbean. Follow the story to the very end. If you enjoyed this, please like and comment with the city you're watching in to let me know how far the story has progressed. The champagne was still cold when Nora Ellison saw her husband's hand slide down another woman's spine. She stood barefoot on the crushed shell path between villas 9 and 10, her sandals dangling from 2 fingers, the hem of her sundress damp from the tide. The Caribbean sky was doing that thing it did right before sunset, bleeding orange and violet into the water like someone had cracked open a paint can, and she'd walked out here to take a photograph for the anniversary dinner Grant had promised her. 5 years. Half a decade of building something she thought was unbreakable. She wanted a picture of the sky to prove the night had been real. Instead, she got this. The cabana was the open-air kind, draped in sheer white linen that billowed like sails in the warm breeze. Through the gap in the fabric, she could see Grant's broad shoulders, the navy polo she'd packed for him that morning, his fingers tangled in hair that was not hers. The woman tilted her head back and laughed, low and intimate, and the sound reached Nora like a slap across still water. It was Simone Alcázar, the woman who'd helped Nora pick out her wedding shoes, the woman who'd cried real tears during Nora's toast at her own bridal shower, the woman who'd texted her 3 days ago, "Have the best trip, babe. You two deserve this. Send pics." Nora's body did something strange. It didn't collapse. It didn't scream. It went completely still, like a circuit breaker tripping in her chest, shutting down everything non-essential so the core could survive the overload. Her vision narrowed. The champagne flute she'd been carrying slipped from her hand and shattered against the shell path, and neither of them heard it over the wind and their own selfish laughter. She turned and walked back toward the main building. Her feet left wet prints on the marble lobby floor. The concierge, a young man named Paolo with careful hands and worried eyes, looked up from the front desk and started to speak, but Nora moved past him without a word, climbed the stairs to the second-floor suite, and locked the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the king-size bed. The room smelled like plumeria and Grant's aftershave. His suitcase was open on the luggage rack, his running shoes kicked off by the bathroom door, his phone charger snaked across the nightstand. Everything about the room said couple. Everything about the room was a lie. She didn't cry. Not yet. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and forced herself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her therapist had taught her after her father died. 4 counts in, 7 counts out. Hold the center. Don't let the shaking start, because once it starts, it won't stop. Her phone buzzed. A text from Grant. "Running late, dinner at 8 instead of 7. Order whatever you want." She stared at the message until the screen went dark. Then she set the phone face down on the bed and stared at the wall. Somewhere outside, the wind was picking up. The next 4 hours happened in fragments, the way trauma always does. Not a smooth narrative, but jagged pieces that didn't fit together right. She must have fallen asleep because she woke to the sound of Grant's keycard in the door. He came in smelling like rum and salt water, and something floral that wasn't her perfume. He moved through the dark room with the practiced ease of a man who had nothing to hide, or who had learned to hide everything so well it looked the same. "You awake?" he whispered. She didn't answer. He showered. She listened to the water run and thought about all the times she'd heard that sound and felt safe. He came out, slid into bed beside her, and within minutes his breathing slowed into sleep. Nora lay in the dark with her eyes open, counting the revolutions of the ceiling fan. At 4:47 a.m., she heard his phone vibrate against the nightstand. 3 quick buzzes, a pattern she recognized because it was the same notification sound Simone used for her texts. A custom vibration they'd set up together one drunk night, laughing about how they needed a secret signal. Nora had thought it was a joke between friends. Now she understood it was a signal between co-conspirators. Grant rolled over, checked the screen, and got out of bed without making a sound. He dressed in the dark, jeans, a dark t-shirt, his good watch. He pulled his passport from the safe, collected both wallets from the dresser, and paused at the door. For one terrible second, Nora thought he was going to say something. An apology. A confession. Anything that would prove some part of the man she'd married still existed. He didn't. He just left. She gave it 20 minutes. Then she reached for her phone and found the screen locked. Not her passcode. A different one. She tried 3 times and got locked out. She went to the room phone and tried calling the front desk, but the line was dead. Power fluctuations, maybe. The storm everyone had been whispering about for 2 days. She opened her laptop. The shared bank account, the one they'd built together over 5 years of combined income, her design commissions and his real estate consulting fees, showed a 0 balance. Transferred out at 4:52 a.m. Every penny. The credit cards were frozen. Her personal savings account, the one she'd linked to their joint profile because Grant had said it was easier for taxes, showed insufficient funds. She sat in the blue glow of the laptop screen and felt something shift inside her, something geological, like a fault line that had been holding steady for years finally giving way. Not heartbreak. That was too pretty a word for what this was. This was demolition. Controlled, systematic demolition, and the man she'd loved had pushed the button while she slept 3 feet away from him. Her throat tightened, her hands shook, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She dressed, jeans, a tank top, sneakers. She threw her things into her suitcase, clothes, toiletries, the leather portfolio she'd brought to review renovation concepts for a potential client. The encrypted USB drive she'd copied the resort's architectural blueprints onto as reference material. She hadn't thought twice about it at the time. It was research, part of the job. The resort's management had shared the files willingly during her design consultation months ago, and she'd loaded them alongside her own mood boards and floor plans. She didn't know yet what was on that drive. She didn't know it would nearly get her killed. Dawn was breaking gray and ugly when she dragged her suitcase down to the lobby. The sky looked bruised, swollen purple clouds stacked on the horizon like something out of a fever dream, and the wind had shifted from warm and playful to cold and mean. The palms along the main pathway were bending at angles that made her stomach clench. Paolo was back at the front desk, and this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a resort blazer, the assistant manager, judging by her name tag, was speaking rapidly into a satellite phone, her face tight with worry. A television mounted behind the desk showed a weather map painted almost entirely in red. "Hurricane Marin," Paolo said when he saw Nora. "Category 3 and strengthening. Mandatory evacuation starts in 4 hours. The last ferry leaves at noon." "I need a ticket," Nora said. Paolo's face did something complicated. "Your room was booked under Mr. Mercer's account. He checked out 30 minutes ago. Both guests." "Both guests," Nora repeated. "He said you'd already left, that you'd taken the early water taxi." The lie was so clean, so efficient, that it almost made her admire him. Almost. He hadn't just abandoned her, he'd erased her, made her a ghost on an island about to be swallowed by the sea. "I need a ticket," she said again, slower this time, as if saying it clearly enough would change the math. "The remaining ferry seats are reserved for guests with active bookings." "I'm sorry, Ms. Ellison. Without a booking or a valid payment method, I can't." "I understand." Her voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a woman who had already been through the worst thing she could imagine and was discovering, with grim fascination, that there were always worse things waiting. "What about the staff evacuation?" Paolo hesitated. The assistant manager glanced over, phone still pressed to her ear, and gave a slight shake of her head. "Staff boats are for employees only," Paolo said carefully. "Insurance liability. I'm sorry." Nora looked at the television screen. The red mass on the weather map was enormous, a swirling eye of destruction aimed directly at the island chain. Estimated landfall, 18 hours. The kind of storm that ripped roofs off concrete buildings and turned swimming pools into mass graves. She had no money, no phone, no ticket, no husband. And somewhere out there, Category 3 was becoming Category 4. She set her suitcase against the wall, rolled up her sleeves, and looked at Paolo. "You need help with the evacuation," she said. It wasn't a question. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or the beginning of respect. He looked at the assistant manager, who was now arguing with someone about generator fuel and clearly too overwhelmed to care about protocol. "We're short-staffed," he admitted. "Half the housekeeping team left on the first ferry this morning. We still have guests in the south wing who need to be moved to the reinforced building." "Show me where." He handed her a staff polo and a two-way radio, and just like that, Nora Ellison became invisible. Not a guest, not a wife, not a woman whose life had just been detonated from the inside. Just another body in a uniform, carrying towels and bottled water down hallways that smelled like industrial cleaner and fear. The South Wing was chaos. Families with small children who didn't understand why they couldn't go to the beach. An elderly couple arguing about whether to bring their medications or their jewelry. A woman in a silk robe screaming at a bellhop because the Wi-Fi was down and she couldn't post her vacation photos. Nora moved through it all with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had already used up her daily allocation of feeling and was running on whatever came after. She carried bags. She reassured children. She translated broken instructions between staff members who spoke different languages. She found a wheelchair for a man with a broken ankle and pushed him through corridors that were starting to leak from the ceiling. She did all of it without thinking about Grant, without thinking about Simone, without thinking about the fact that she was one missed ferry away from dying on a beautiful island that wasn't hers. It was somewhere between the South Wing and the reinforced building, the hotel's designated storm shelter, a bunker-like structure built into the hillside behind the main pool, that she first noticed the man watching her from the second-floor balcony of the presidential wing. He was older than her, maybe 40, maybe 45, dark hair, dark eyes, a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. He wore a simple linen shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he stood with his hands on the railing, watching the evacuation below with an expression that was equal parts calculation and curiosity. There was a woman beside him, small, silver-haired, wrapped in a shawl despite the heat. His mother, maybe. She was speaking to him quietly, and he was nodding, but his eyes stayed on Nora. She didn't know who he was. She wouldn't learn his name for another 6 hours. All she knew in that moment was that someone was watching, and she didn't have the energy to care. She turned away and went back to work. The storm arrived ahead of schedule. By 2 p.m., the evacuation was only 3/4 complete. The last ferry had departed at noon with every seat filled, and the remaining guests, maybe 40 people, were being herded into the reinforced building along with the skeleton crew of staff who'd volunteered to stay. The sky had turned the color of a bruise that wouldn't heal, and the wind was screaming through the resort like something alive and furious. Nora was in the main lobby, helping Paolo stack sandbags against the glass entrance doors when the first window blew. It wasn't dramatic. No slow-motion crack, no warning groan, just a sudden explosive pop, like a gunshot, and then glass was everywhere. A horizontal rain of shards that filled the air with crystalline fury. She hit the floor instinctively, covering her head with her arms. She felt something bite into her left forearm. A shard, maybe 2 inches long, buried in the soft tissue below her elbow. She pulled it out without thinking, the pain arriving a full second after the blood, and pressed her palm against the wound. "Move!" Paolo was shouting. "Everybody move to the shelter! Now!" The lobby was coming apart. Ceiling tiles peeled away in sheets. Water poured through the compromised window frame in horizontal torrents. A section of decorative molding tore free from the wall and cartwheeled across the marble floor like a wooden boomerang. Nora grabbed the radio from her belt. "South Wing clear," she shouted into it, static. Then a broken voice. "2 guests still in room 14. Can't get the door." She was running before the transmission ended. Down the corridor toward the South Wing, through ankle-deep water that tasted like salt and chlorine, past emergency lights that flickered like dying stars. The wind was inside the building now, turning every hallway into a wind tunnel, and each step felt like pushing against a wall made of air and fury. Room 14. The door was jammed. Not locked, jammed, the frame swollen with water until the wood had expanded beyond the doorframe's capacity. She could hear someone inside, banging, calling out in a language she didn't recognize. She kicked the door. Once. Twice. Her sneakers were soaked, and the rubber soles slipped against the wet floor, throwing her off balance. She braced herself against the opposite wall, planted her feet, and drove her shoulder into the door with everything she had. It didn't give. She looked around. The hallway was filling fast. Water up to her shins now, brown and foul-smelling, carrying debris from somewhere upstream. A fire extinguisher was mounted on the wall 10 feet back. She waded to it, pulled it free, and used the heavy steel base like a battering ram, swinging it into the door handle with both hands. The handle broke. The door lurched inward. 2 terrified teenagers, a boy and a girl, maybe 15 and 17, stumbled out into the hallway, clutching each other and crying. "Follow me," Nora said. "Don't stop. Don't look back." They made it halfway back to the lobby before the ceiling collapsed. It happened with a sound like the world tearing in half. A deep, structural groan followed by an avalanche of plaster, rebar, and waterlogged acoustic tile. Nora shoved both teenagers forward, felt them stumble past her, and then something enormous hit her across the back and drove her face first into the water. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Weight pressed down on her shoulders and spine. A section of steel beam, maybe, or a chunk of concrete support column. The water was rising around her face, brown and warm and smelling like rust. She tried to push up, but her arms had no leverage, and the weight was too much, and the water was at her chin now, lapping against her lower lip like a patient predator. This is it, she thought. Not the heartbreak, not the betrayal, not the empty bank account, or the dead phone, or the husband who erased her. This. Drowning in a hallway that smelled like rust while a hurricane ate the building around her. Her fingers scraped against the submerged floor, looking for something, anything, to grab. She found the edge of a doorframe and pulled, but the debris shifted and pressed harder, and the water touched her nose, and she closed her eyes and held what she had left of breath and thought about her father, about his hands, about the way he used to say, "Buildings don't fall down, sweetheart. People just forget how to hold them up." Then the weight was gone. Hands, large, rough, impossibly strong, gripped the beam across her back and wrenched it upward. She gasped, swallowing water and air in equal measure, coughing so hard it felt like her ribs were cracking. Someone grabbed her under the arms and lifted her out of the flood like she weighed nothing, pulling her backward through the corridor and through a doorway she hadn't noticed. She was on the floor of a room that was drier than it should have been. Some kind of utility closet, maybe, or a service corridor. Emergency lighting cast everything in pale amber. She coughed until her lungs were raw and then lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, breathing. The man from the balcony was kneeling beside her. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed from a distance. A thin scar running along his jawline, the kind of weathered tan that comes from years spent outdoors, hands that were elegant but scarred, like a surgeon who moonlighted as a bare-knuckle fighter. His linen shirt was soaked and torn at the shoulder. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they studied her with an intensity that was neither warm nor cold, just absolute. "Can you breathe?" His voice was low, controlled. American, but with something underneath it. Italian, maybe, or Mediterranean, worn smooth by years of careful neutrality. Nora coughed again, spat water, nodded. "The kids," she rasped. "Room 14, did they? My men have them. They're in the shelter." His men. She filed that away for later examination. He helped her sit up. His grip was careful but impersonal, the way you'd handle something valuable that didn't belong to you. She leaned against the wall and pressed her hand to the wound on her forearm, which was bleeding freely now, the makeshift pressure she'd applied earlier washed away by the flood. "You need stitches," he said, looking at her arm. "I need a lot of things." The ghost of something. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that a smile might have been appropriate under different circumstances. Crossed his face and disappeared. "I'm Dominic," he said. "Nora. I know who you are. The woman your husband left behind." The words landed like a fist to the sternum. Not because they were cruel. They weren't. They were delivered with the same clinical precision as everything else about this man, a statement of fact offered without judgment or sympathy. That was almost worse. "News travels fast on a small island," she said. "I don't rely on news." He reached for a first aid kit mounted on the wall, the kind stocked in industrial kitchens. and opened it with practiced efficiency. Hold still. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic wipes, his movements precise and unhurried despite the fact that the building was disintegrating around them. The sting was extraordinary, and Nora hissed through her teeth, but she didn't pull away. "You should have been on the ferry," he said, not looking up from her arm. "I should have been a lot of things." He applied butterfly closures to the gash. Not stitches, but close enough to hold. Then he wrapped the forearm in gauze, tore the medical tape with his teeth, and secured it. "My people have a reinforced section in the presidential wing," he said. "Generator power, satellite communications, supplies for 72 hours. You can stay there until the storm passes." She looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, at the careful hands, at the way he knelt beside her on a wet floor in a collapsing building and spoke about satellite communications and 72-hour supply caches as casually as other men talked about weekend plans. "Why?" she asked. "Because you're bleeding on a floor, and the nearest hospital is underwater." "That's not what I mean." He met her eyes, held them. The emergency light flickered, casting shadows that made his face look older, harder, more dangerous. "My mother saw you helping people," he said. "She told me to bring you inside." It was such a simple answer that it almost had to be true. Almost. "Okay," Nora said. He helped her stand. They moved through service corridors she hadn't known existed, back hallways and maintenance passages that ran behind the resort's public spaces like veins behind a face. Dominic navigated them without hesitation, which meant he'd studied the building's layout before the storm, which meant he was the kind of man who always knew where the exits were. The presidential wing was a different world. While the rest of the resort was being torn apart by wind and water, this section felt solid. Reinforced concrete walls, steel frame windows that held against the screaming gale, emergency generators humming steadily behind sealed doors. 3 men in dark clothing stood at various points along the corridor, and they straightened slightly when Dominic passed but said nothing. They were not resort security. Resort security wore khaki shorts and concerned expressions. These men wore tactical composure the way other people wore suits. The silver-haired woman was waiting in the suite's living room, seated in an armchair with a blanket across her knees and a cup of tea steaming on the side table. She looked up when Dominic brought Nora through the door, and her face, wrinkled and sharp and alive with intelligence, broke into something that wasn't quite concern and wasn't quite warmth, but existed in the complicated space between them. "You're the one from the lobby," she said. Her accent was thicker than Dominic's, pure Southern Italian wrapped in decades of American vowels. "Yes, ma'am. Sit. Eat something. You look like the storm has been chewing on you." Nora sat. Someone, one of the silent men, brought her water, a sandwich, a dry towel. She drank and ate and dried her face and hands and felt the adrenaline begin to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made her limbs feel like they were filled with wet sand. Dominic stood by the window, watching the storm through reinforced glass. The wind outside was catastrophic now. Solid sheets of water moving horizontally through the air, palm trees snapping like matchsticks, whole sections of roofing material spiraling into the darkness. The sound was enormous, a roar that vibrated in the chest and made conversation feel like shouting across a canyon. "Your husband," Dominic said without turning from the window. "Grant Mercer." Nora's hands tightened around the water glass. "What about him?" "He left the island at 5 a.m. on a private charter. A boat registered to a company called Meridian Coastal Development. They docked at the mainland port in St. Lucie before the harbor closed." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I know a lot of things about the people who come to this island. It's a habit." The old woman, his mother, made a small sound that might have been disapproval or amusement. Dominic ignored it. "Meridian Coastal Development," Nora said slowly. "I've never heard of it." "You wouldn't have. It's a shell company. 3 layers of corporate registration spread across the Caymans, Panama, and a post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. On paper, it's a boutique real estate consulting firm. In practice, it's the money laundering arm of a development syndicate that has been buying up protected coastal land across the Caribbean for the last 7 years. The words were precise, delivered with the calm authority of someone reading a financial report. But underneath them, Nora could feel something else. A controlled anger, perhaps, or the kind of professional interest that people in Dominic's world reserved for threats to their territory. "I don't understand," she said. "What does that have to do with Grant?" Dominic turned from the window. His face was unreadable. "Your husband has been selling proprietary architectural data to Meridian for at least 18 months. Structural blueprints, geological surveys, environmental impact assessments, the kind of information that would allow a developer to bypass every regulatory obstacle standing between them and billions of dollars in illegal coastal construction." Nora set the water glass down very carefully because her hands were shaking and she didn't want to drop it. "Grant is a real estate consultant," she said. "He advises clients on property acquisition. That's what he does." "That's what he tells you he does." The silence between them was heavy, layered, full of things Nora wasn't ready to believe. She looked at the old woman, who was watching her with an expression of deep, unsentimental compassion. The look of someone who had seen people receive bad news before and knew there was nothing to say that would make it hurt less. "The resort blueprints," Nora said quietly. "The ones from the design consultation." Dominic's eyes sharpened. "What about them?" "I have them. On a USB drive. In my suitcase." The room went very still. "The originals?" Dominic asked. "Copies, but they're encrypted master files, the full architectural package, structural engineering, underground utility mapping, geological bore samples, everything. The resort management gave me access for the renovation proposal. I loaded them onto a portable drive because I was reviewing design concepts on the flight down." Dominic moved away from the window. One of the silent men shifted his weight near the door. A subtle adjustment, almost imperceptible, but Nora noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure. "Where's your suitcase?" Dominic asked. "The lobby. I left it against the wall by the front desk." He spoke a single word in Italian to the man by the door, who disappeared into the corridor without a sound. "If what you're saying is true," Dominic said, and his voice had changed, still controlled, still quiet, but with an edge beneath it now, like a blade being drawn from a sheath, "then you are in possession of the only surviving original encrypted files. Meridian has been working with reconstructed copies, partial data, enough to plan but not enough to execute. The originals contain verification codes that authenticate every survey and assessment. Without them, the project can be challenged in court. With them, it's bulletproof." "I didn't know any of that." "I believe you." "Grant knew I had those files?" "Grant packed your laptop bag himself, didn't he?" She opened her mouth, closed it. He had. The morning before the flight, while she was in the shower, she'd come out to find her bag neatly organized. Laptop, chargers, the leather portfolio, the USB drives. She'd thought it was thoughtful. An anniversary gesture. A husband taking care of the details. "He needed the originals off the resort's secure server," Dominic said. "Downloading them himself would have left a digital footprint. But if his wife, an independent design consultant with legitimate access, happened to copy the files for her own professional use, and then those files happened to disappear during a chaotic hurricane evacuation." He let the sentence hang. Nora's vision narrowed. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, in the wound on her forearm, in the base of her skull. "He didn't just leave me," she said. The words came out flat, drained of everything except the raw architecture of understanding. "He set me up." "Yes. And now he needs those files back. More precisely, the people he's selling them to need them back. And those people do not send polite emails when their investments are threatened." The old woman reached across the space between them and placed her hand over Nora's. Her palm was dry and cool and surprisingly strong. "Mangia," she said softly. "Eat. Then we think." But Nora wasn't hungry anymore. She was something else entirely, something she didn't have a word for yet, something that lived in the space between fury and terror and the horrible clarity that comes when you realize the person you trusted most in the world was never the person you thought they were. She looked at Dominic. "Who are you?" she asked. "And don't tell me you're a tourist." The old woman made that sound again. Definitely amusement this time. Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. the scar along his jawline catching the light. "My name is Dominic DeLuca," he said. "My family has interests in this region. Some of those interests intersect with the people your husband is working for, not in a way either side appreciates." "Interests," Nora repeated. "Yes, the kind of interests that come with armed men standing in hallways? The kind that require careful management." She could have pushed. She could have asked the questions that were lining up behind her teeth like bullets in a magazine. Who he really was, what his family did, why a man with armed guards and satellite phones and intelligence networks was staying at a resort that was about to be destroyed by a hurricane. But exhaustion was pulling at her now, dragging her toward a darkness that wasn't sleep, but wasn't consciousness either, and the wound on her arm was throbbing in time with her heartbeat, and somewhere outside the reinforced glass, the hurricane was tearing the world apart. "I just want to go home," she said. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "When the storm passes," he said, "we'll get you off the island, but the files stay with us until we know what we're dealing with. They're not yours. They're not yours either, not really, but right now they might be the only thing keeping you alive." The wind screamed against the windows. The generator hummed. The old woman squeezed Nora's hand once, then released it and returned to her tea. Nora closed her eyes and leaned back against the chair. She thought about Grant's hands on Simone's back. She thought about the empty bank account. She thought about the collapsed ceiling and the rising water and the moment she'd been sure she was going to die in a hallway that smelled like rust. She thought about the USB drive in her suitcase, sitting in a flooded lobby, carrying secrets worth killing for. Sleep came, but it brought no peace. She woke to silence. Not true silence. The storm was still raging, but the worst of its fury had moved north, leaving behind a heavy, sullen rain that drummed against the roof like impatient fingers. The emergency lights were still on, casting the suite in their amber glow, and the generator's hum was a constant, low-frequency presence that she could feel in her back teeth. Dominic's mother was asleep in the armchair, wrapped in her shawl. One of the silent men stood near the balcony door, facing outward. Dominic himself was seated at a desk in the corner of the room, a laptop open in front of him, the screen's blue light painting harsh shadows across his face. He was speaking quietly into a satellite phone, his voice too low for Nora to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, clipped, commanding, the voice of a man issuing orders that would be followed without question. She sat up, her body protested, every joint stiff, every muscle sore, the wound on her arm a hot, angry line of pain. She flexed her fingers experimentally. They worked. That was something. Dominic ended his call and looked at her. "Your suitcase is in the next room," he said. "Marco retrieved it before the lobby flooded completely. The USB drive is still inside." Relief washed through her, followed immediately by a new kind of anxiety. The awareness that the thing keeping her alive was also the thing putting her in danger, and that as long as she had it, she was standing at the center of a target she couldn't see. "I checked the files," Dominic said. "Military-grade encryption. Whoever set up the resort's data security knew what they were doing." "My father designed this resort," Nora said, and the words came out before she'd decided to share them. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalibration, perhaps. A piece of a puzzle sliding into place. "Adrian Ellison," he said. "You know his name." "I know a lot of names." She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he closed the laptop and stood, moving to the window with the fluid economy of a man who was always aware of every angle in a room. "The storm will break by morning," he said. "When it does, we'll have a narrow window, maybe 6 hours before conditions deteriorate again. I'm arranging transport to the mainland." "For me?" "For all of us. This island is compromised. If Meridian's people know you have those files, and they will know because your husband will tell them, then they'll send someone to retrieve them. And the people they send won't knock first." Nora stood. Her legs were unsteady, but they held. She walked to the window and stood beside him, close enough to smell the salt and sweat and something else, something sharper, like gunpowder or machine oil, that clung to his skin. Through the reinforced glass, the resort was unrecognizable. The pool was a churning lake of brown water and debris. The cabana where she'd seen Grant and Simone was gone, not damaged, gone, ripped from its foundations and scattered across the beach like confetti. Half the south wing's roof was missing. Trees lay across pathways like fallen soldiers. "When I get to the mainland," Nora said slowly, "I'll turn the files over to the authorities, the police, the FBI, whoever handles this kind of thing. Then it's not my problem anymore." Dominic was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "The syndicate behind Meridian has connections inside law enforcement. Not all of them, but enough. If you walk into a police station with that drive, there's a reasonable chance the files disappear before they ever reach a courtroom, and you disappear along with them. So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you need protection before you need justice. And I'm suggesting that justice, when it comes, needs to be delivered through channels that can't be compromised." She turned to face him. They were close enough that she could see the individual threads of gray at his temples, the fine lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched as if he were physically restraining words he wasn't ready to speak. "Why do you care?" she asked. "About me? About any of this?" "Meridian's construction project would destroy a section of coastline that my family has protected for decades. Not for profit, for principle. My father made a commitment to preserve these islands, and I intend to honor it." "Your father? He's gone now, but his promises aren't." There was something in the way he said it, a weight, a reverence stripped of sentimentality that made Nora think of her own father. Of the man who had built beautiful things and died too young and left behind blueprints that were now at the center of something he never could have imagined. "I'm not a tool for your family's territorial dispute," she said. "I'm not leverage." "No," Dominic agreed. "You're not. But you are the only person standing between a corrupt syndicate and a coastline they intend to destroy. Whether you chose that position or not, it's where you are." The rain intensified for a moment, hammering against the glass with renewed fury, and then subsided. Somewhere in the distance, something heavy crashed. Another section of roof, maybe, or a retaining wall giving way. "When this is over," Nora said, "I go home. I rebuild my life. I never see any of you again." Dominic looked at her. That not-quite smile appeared again, gone as quickly as it came. "When this is over," he said, "you can do whatever you want. But first, we both have to survive the next 72 hours. His phone buzzed. He answered it, listened for 15 seconds, and his face went hard. Not angry, but locked, the way a vault door looks when the mechanism engages. "What?" Nora asked. "My people intercepted communications from the mainland. Grant didn't just report the missing files." He paused, and in that pause, Nora felt the floor shift beneath her, not from the storm, but from the weight of what was coming. "He told Meridian exactly where you are. They've dispatched a recovery team, 6 men, armed. They're waiting for the storm to break." The generator hummed, the rain fell. The old woman stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in Italian that sounded like a name. Nora looked at the window, at the ruined paradise beyond it, at the dark water churning beneath the shattered palms. She thought about the USB drive in the next room. She thought about 6 armed men crossing the water to find her. She thought about Grant, the man who had promised to love her, who had kissed her at the altar, who had slept beside her for 5 years, calling in mercenaries to silence the woman he'd already destroyed. Something inside her finished breaking. And something else, something harder, something with teeth, began to take its place. "Then I guess we'd better be ready," she said. Dominic DeLuca looked at Nora Ellison, and for the first time since she'd met him, something in his expression shifted beyond calculation, beyond professional assessment, beyond the careful mask of a man who controlled everything within his reach. It was brief, a flicker. The recognition of something he hadn't expected to find on a drowning island in the middle of a hurricane. He nodded once. "Yes," he said, "we'd better." Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere beyond the black water, 6 men were loading weapons and studying maps and waiting for the wind to die. The storm didn't die. It retreated. There was a difference, and Nora understood it the way you understand the difference between a dog that runs away and a dog that backs into a corner. The wind dropped from a scream to a moan sometime around 4 in the morning, and the rain thinned from a solid wall of water to a persistent, ugly drizzle, and the pressure in the air changed, not released, just redistributed, coiled somewhere offshore like a fist pulling back before the second swing. Dominic knew it too. She could tell by the way he stood at the window without relaxing. His shoulders never dropped. His hands stayed loose at his sides, not resting, not braced, just ready, the way a man's hands look when he spent enough years needing them to move fast. "How long?" she asked. 4 hours, maybe 5. Then the back wall hits. The back wall. The other side of the eye. The storm wraps around. It comes back. He turned from the window. We move before that happens. She'd slept maybe 90 minutes, the hard, dreamless sleep of a body that had simply stopped working and needed rebooting rather than rest. She felt the difference between that and real sleep in every joint. Her arm throbbed under the gauze. Her back felt like someone had driven a steel rod through it during the collapse, which was more or less what had happened. Marco, the man who'd retrieved her suitcase, a compact, quiet individual with the kind of stillness that suggested he'd learned to be invisible as a survival skill, brought her coffee without being asked. It was strong and bitter, and exactly what she needed, and she drank it standing up while Dominic spoke quietly with his other men. There were 3 of them. Marco, who moved like smoke. A larger man named Enzo, broad-shouldered, with a broken nose that had healed crooked and eyes that were doing continuous geometry on the room's entry points. And a third one, younger, maybe late 20s, olive-skinned and sharp-featured, who everyone called Sal and who spoke only to relay information, never to contribute opinions. Nora got the impression that opinions were not part of Sal's job description. Dominic's mother, Lucia, was awake now, and sitting at the small dining table with the focused attention of a woman who had spent decades listening to men plan dangerous things and had learned to translate everything they left unsaid. She watched Nora with eyes that were brown and deep-set and missed nothing. "You design buildings," Lucia said. "Interiors. My father was the structural architect." Adrian Ellison. It was the second time someone in this room had said her father's name without being told it. The second time it felt less like coincidence and more like an edge pressing against something she hadn't noticed was there. "You keep saying his name like you know him," Nora said. Lucia's hands folded around her teacup. It was a deliberate gesture, the kind of movement that buys time while the speaker arranges things in an order they can live with. "I knew of him. My husband spoke of him." "Your husband?" "Carlo De Luca." She said the name with the careful neutrality of someone who has made peace with a complicated legacy. "He and your father crossed paths. A long time ago. Before you were born, I think." Dominic, at the desk, had gone very still. Nora set her coffee down. "How?" "Later," Dominic said. Not rude, directive. The word of a man who was managing multiple timelines at once and had just made a decision about sequencing. "We move first, history after." Lucia made a small sound, not disagreement, but a mother's annotation of a son's curtness. Nora let it go. Dominic was right about one thing. The timing was brutal, and nostalgia was a luxury that would get them killed. The plan was thin but structured. Dominic's contact on the mainland, he didn't name this person, and Nora understood she wasn't meant to ask, had a boat standing by at the resort service dock on the island's leeward side. The leeward dock was more sheltered from the storm's path, which meant the water was navigable in the break between the storm's 2 halves. The crossing to the mainland took 40 minutes in good conditions. In current conditions, they were looking at 90, maybe 110. "What about the other people in the shelter?" Nora asked. "The guests? The staff?" "The resort's management has a second boat coming, larger. Coast Guard is coordinating from the mainland." Dominic looked at her evenly. "They'll be evacuated. I'm not abandoning 40 people to save 4. 5, she said, a pause. 5. And the files. Travel inside your body at all times. If we get separated..." He stopped. "We won't get separated." "But if we do..." His jaw tightened. He looked at Marco, who produced a small waterproof pouch, the kind used for satellite communicators in maritime environments, and handed it to Nora. She put the USB drive inside and sealed it, then hung the lanyard around her neck and tucked it under her shirt. The plastic was cold against her sternum. They moved out at 5:20 a.m. The resort was nearly unrecognizable. What the hurricane had not destroyed outright, it had rearranged with the arbitrary brutality of a child scattering toys. The main pathway was buried under 3 feet of debris, palm fronds, splintered furniture, sections of roofing tile, what appeared to be an entire outdoor bar that had migrated 40 feet from its original location. The ornamental pool had overflowed and merged with the beach access corridor, creating a shallow brown river that sucked at their ankles and smelled like sewage and brine. Nora moved behind Marco in front of Enzo, with Sal at the rear. Dominic walked beside his mother with one hand on her elbow, not hovering, just present, a touch that said, "I've got you," without making it a negotiation. Lucia moved with careful dignity through the wreckage, her jaw set, her eyes forward. She was 70-something years old, picking her way through hurricane debris at 5 in the morning, and she was doing it without complaint or drama, which told Nora more about this family than anything else had. They were halfway across the main courtyard when Enzo held up one fist and everyone stopped. The silence was immediate. Nora felt it in her chest. That specific physical quiet of 6 people deciding simultaneously to stop breathing. Enzo's eyes were moving across the roofline of the east wing. His hand rested at his side in a way that made it clear there was something under his jacket that wasn't a wallet. 30 seconds. A minute. Nothing moved in the ruins except for the slow drip of water from shattered gutters. Enzo lowered his fist. They moved again. "How many entry points from the water?" Dominic asked quietly, not looking at Marco. "Service dock is the cleanest. Mercer's people would know about the main pier. It's in the guest documentation. They might not know about the maintenance entrance on the northern face." "Might not. It's not on the public maps. It's on the architectural plans." Another silence. This one pointed. Nora felt both men's attention shift to her, or rather to the drive against her sternum, and understood that the gap between might not know and definitely don't know was exactly the width of the crisis she was carrying. "My father's original blueprints include every access point," she said. "If Grant gave them a copy of even the partial data, they know the northern entrance," Dominic finished. "So we assume all approaches are compromised." Marco's expression didn't change, but he angled his body slightly toward the east, which seemed to mean something because Sal immediately adjusted his position at the rear. They kept moving. The service dock was on the far side of a maintenance complex, a cluster of low concrete buildings that housed the resort's generators, laundry facilities, and equipment storage. The complex had survived the storm better than anything else on the island, which made structural sense. Utilitarian buildings built to house heavy machinery tended to be more honestly engineered than luxury villas built to house wealthy tourists. They came around the eastern corner of the laundry building and found Paolo sitting on an upturned plastic crate outside the generator room, holding a 2-way radio and looking like a man who had made his peace with whatever the next few hours were going to bring. He looked up when they appeared and stood quickly, relief and wariness fighting for his face. "You made it," he said to Nora. Then to Dominic. "The other shelter. We still have 38 guests and 7 staff. The Coast Guard boat is 60 minutes out." "They'll hold," Dominic said. "I need to stay with them." "I know." Paolo looked at Nora with an expression that was specific to people who have survived something terrible together and are about to go in different directions. It didn't require words. She nodded. He nodded back. That was the whole of it. "The dock," Dominic said. "Clear when I checked 40 minutes ago. I don't know about since." "Show me." Paolo led them around the maintenance complex to a chain-link gate that opened onto a concrete walkway above the waterline, or what had been the waterline before the storm surge. Now the dock was partially submerged, the floating sections bobbing at strange angles, but the fixed concrete pier was intact, and tied to its cleats was a twin-engine powerboat that looked fast and serious, and completely out of place among the resort's recreational watercraft. Dominic's contact was already there. A woman, which surprised Nora. Not because women were surprising, but because everything about this operation had been coded masculine until now. She was around 40, dark-haired, wearing a bright orange foul-weather jacket over what appeared to be tactical clothing, and she moved around the boat with the efficient authority of someone who had driven it through worse conditions than this. "Valeria," Dominic said. 40 minutes late," she said, without looking up from the mooring line she was freeing. Hurricane. I noticed. She looked up then, assessed the group with the speed of a customs official trained to find things people are hiding, and her eyes stopped on Nora. This her? Yes. Valeria looked at Nora for a moment longer than was comfortable. It wasn't hostile. It was clinical, the look of a professional calculating risk variables. DeLuca, she said to Dominic, we need to talk, privately. Talk here. Valeria's jaw tightened. I'm serious. So am I. Everyone here is cleared. Another long pause. Valeria glanced at Lucia, who had settled onto a dock cleat with the patient stillness of a woman who had sat through 100 conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. I got a signal 40 minutes ago, Valeria said. My contact at the harbor master's office. A rigid inflatable, 6 passengers, came off the water on the northern side of the island 20 minutes ago. They're on foot. How far? At their pace? Through this debris field? Valeria calculated. 20 minutes, maybe 15. Dominic absorbed this without visible reaction. He turned to Enzo and spoke 4 words in Italian. Enzo moved immediately, positioning himself at the landward end of the pier with a clear sightline up the maintenance road. Everyone on the boat, Dominic said. Marco, Valeria said, I need him at the stern. Go. Nora was on the boat. She didn't remember deciding to step off the pier. Her body had made the decision before her mind caught up, the same survival reflex that had carried her through the flooding corridor the night before. Lucia was beside her, guided down the steps by Sal's steady hand. Marco was at the stern, doing something technical with the engines that produced a low, promising rumble. Dominic was still on the pier. He was looking up the maintenance road, hands loose at his sides, and there was something in his posture, an absolute unhurried readiness, that made Nora's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Get on the boat, she said. He didn't look at her. DeLuca. Valeria's voice from the helm. We need to move. 15 seconds passed. 20. Then Enzo said something sharp from the end of the pier, and Dominic stepped onto the boat in one smooth motion, and Valeria had them off the dock before his second foot landed. The boat accelerated into the gray water with a force that pushed Nora backward against the stern rail. The island fell away behind them. Its devastated shoreline, the shattered palms, the gutted luxury that had sold people the fantasy of a perfect world and delivered a hurricane instead. She gripped the rail and watched it recede and tried to feel something other than the specific numbness of a person who has been through too much in too short a time and is running on the residue of feeling rather than the feeling itself. Lucia sat in the covered section, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes closed. Not sleeping. The posture was too deliberate for sleep. Processing, maybe. Filing things away in the careful internal architecture of a woman who had learned to carry weights that would break other people by distributing them across time. The crossing was brutal. 20-foot swells, occasional horizontal rain, the boat's hull slamming into each wave with a percussive violence that resonated through every bone. Valeria handled it with flat competence. No bravado, no commentary, just hands on the wheel and eyes on the water, and occasional course adjustments delivered like small arguments she was winning against the sea. Dominic sat across from Nora in the stern, braced against the rail, and did not speak. His eyes moved between the water ahead and the shrinking island behind them, conducting a continuous threat assessment with the mechanical regularity of a process that had long since become unconscious. After maybe 40 minutes, Nora's nausea won. She leaned over the stern rail and lost the coffee and what was left of the sandwich she'd eaten hours ago. It was neither graceful nor quiet. When she straightened up, eyes watering, she found Dominic holding a bottle of water out to her without comment or expression. Thank you, she managed. Storm will do that. I don't get motion sick. You've been through significant physical trauma in the last 12 hours. Your body is running on reserves. The motion is just the thing it picked to complain about. She rinsed her mouth, spit over the rail, pressed the cold bottle against her forehead for a moment, and breathed through her nose until her stomach settled into something like acceptance. Tell me about your father, she said. It wasn't what she'd meant to say, but it was what came out. which was how the important things usually surfaced, sideways, when the defenses were down. Dominic's expression shifted, not softened, adjusted, the way a controlled demolition shifts when the engineer decides to proceed. Carlo De Luca ran specific operations along the Atlantic coast for 3 decades, he said. Not a man who left much of himself in the light, but he had lines he wouldn't cross. Structural corruption, the kind that gets people killed, was one of them. And your line? The same. Because he taught you, or because you chose it? A pause that was longer than the question deserved, which meant it was exactly the right question. Both, he said. The mainland appeared through the rain, a dark coastline with the scattered lights of a small harbor town pressing through the gray. The people on that boat who came ashore, Nora said, they're not going to stop just because we made the crossing. No. And Grant is on the mainland. He was already there when those men deployed. She thought about that, about the geometry of it. Grant, already safe on the mainland, having put 6 armed men in motion to retrieve what he'd arranged for her to carry without knowing it. Using her as a mule, then cleaning up the mess with hired violence. The whole thing was so neat, so efficient, that it felt almost architectural, which figured since Grant had married an architect's daughter. "Do you have a place to go?" she asked. "On the mainland." "Yes." "And me?" "With us, until I know the threat level and you've had time to decide your next move." "I've decided my next move, the FBI field office." Dominic looked at her directly for the first time since the dock. "I told you. I know what you told me. I also know that you have specific reasons to want those files handled through your channels instead of federal ones, and I'm not naive enough to think your interest in protecting me is completely separate from your interest in what I'm carrying." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No, but they're not the same either." The boat came around a breakwater, and the harbor appeared fully. A working fishing port, not a tourist marina, with low buildings and industrial docks, and the smell of diesel and dead fish that somehow felt honest after the manicured horror of the resort. Valeria cut the engines to idle and navigated toward a slip at the far end of the commercial dock. "There is a federal contact," Dominic said, "a specific prosecutor at the DOJ's Organized Crime Division. She spent 4 years building a case against the Meridian Network. She's not compromised. I know this because I have spent 2 of those 4 years watching her to make sure." Nora looked at him. "You've been building toward this. Before I arrived. Before any of this happened to me." "Yes. And now I'm here with the one piece of evidence that finishes the case." "Yes. And you're going to tell me that was coincidence." "I'm going to tell you that it doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is what we do with it." The boat touched the dock. Valeria killed the engines. The sudden near silence was disorienting, just rain and the creak of the hull against the dock, and somewhere, a bell ringing with the rhythm of the tide. They disembarked. Sal was first off, moving immediately to the dock's landward gate and scanning the approach. Enzo helped Lucia to the dock with a care that seemed at odds with everything else about him. Marco stayed with the boat, doing something with the mooring lines that seemed to involve making it very easy to leave again quickly. A black SUV was waiting on the road above the dock, engine running, windows tinted, a figure behind the wheel who did not get out. Dominic's infrastructure on the mainland was clearly intact, which raised a number of questions that Nora filed under "not right now" and planned to revisit at length. They were halfway up the dock walkway when her phone, her actual phone, which Marco had quietly produced from a waterproof bag during the crossing with a brief explanation that he'd found it in her suitcase and, it appeared, bypassed Grant's remote lock, began to ring. She stopped, looked at the screen. Grant. The others kept moving and then slowed and then stopped because she had stopped, and because Dominic had a precise awareness of every person within his orbit and had noticed. He looked at the phone, then at her. "You don't have to," he said. "I know." She answered it. 3 seconds of silence. Then Grant's voice, familiar as her own pulse, shaped by 5 years of morning coffee and shared meals and 1,000 small intimacies that had all been, she now understood, infrastructure for a lie. Nora. He sounded controlled, not guilty, not frightened, so calibrated, like a man who had decided on an emotional register and was performing it. I need you to listen to me. You have 30 seconds, she said. Use them. The drive, the architectural files. I need you to give them to whoever has you right now and walk away. This isn't, you weren't supposed to be part of this. It was a business transaction. It got complicated. But if you hold on to those files and the people you're with use them the way they're planning to, you are going to be caught in the middle of something that will destroy everything you but 20 seconds. Nora. His voice cracked, and she couldn't tell if it was real or engineered. I know what I did was wrong. The money, Simone. I know. And I'll face that. But right now I'm trying to keep you alive, and the man beside you is not who you think he is. He is not protecting you. He is using you the exact same way I did, and the sooner you… Time. She ended the call. The dock was quiet. Rain pinged against metal. Lucia was watching her from the walkway with that deep, unsentimental expression. Nora's hands were not shaking. She was mildly surprised by this. She looked at her hands, cataloged their steadiness, and decided it was either evidence of genuine resolve or the numbness of a person so far past the normal threshold of shock that the body had simply stopped registering new input. He said you're using me, she told Dominic. Yes. That's not a denial. No, he said. It isn't. The rain fell between them. Enzo and Sal stood at careful distances, pretending to watch the perimeter, but clearly tracking the conversation. Here's what I know, Nora said. He stole from me, cheated on me, stranded me, and sent armed men to retrieve evidence that could put him in prison. You rescued me from a collapsing building, provided medical care, organized safe evacuation for me and 40 other people, and told me the truth about a federal contact who might actually be able to use what I'm carrying. Those are the facts. The motivations behind the facts are complicated and maybe not entirely clean on either side, but the facts are the facts. Dominic looked at her steadily. So here's what happens, she continued. You give me the name of the DOJ prosecutor, her direct contact, not a switchboard, not an intermediary. I verify independently that she's who you say she is. If she checks out, I make contact through you. The files go to her, not to your organization's use first. In exchange, you and your people get credit for delivering them, which I assume has some value in your world. We proceed together until the transfer is made. After that, you go your direction and I go mine. A long silence. Sal made a sound that might have been admiration. Dominic put his hand inside his jacket and produced a business card, cream-colored, heavy stock, with a name and a number and no affiliation. He held it out. Nora took it. Catherine Reeves, she read. Department of Justice, Organized Crime Task Force. She'll know my name. Tell her the Meridian files have come through. Has she been waiting for them? For 2 years. Nora put the card in her pocket. They walked up to the SUV, and the doors opened and closed, and the vehicle pulled onto the road that led away from the harbor, and the rain came down and the sea receded behind them. And somewhere to the south, the hurricane was gathering itself for its second pass. The safe house was not what she'd expected. She'd been constructing a mental image during the drive, something cinematic, a compound with armed guards and steel doors, and the aesthetic of consequence. Instead, it was a 2-story house on the edge of a small coastal town that looked exactly like every other 2-story house on the street, painted pale yellow, slightly weathered, a garden at the front that someone tended with genuine care. The kind of house that neighbors never noticed, which was probably the point. Inside, it was clean and functional. 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, furniture that was comfortable without being memorable. Lucia went immediately to the kitchen and began doing the thing that Nora suspected she always did when confronted with uncontrollable circumstances. She started cooking. The smell of onions hitting hot oil was so aggressively normal that Nora stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and felt something fracture inside her. Not grief, or not only grief, but the specific anguish of normalcy encountered in the middle of catastrophe. The recognition that the world continued to smell like onions and warm bread even when your life was in pieces. She sat at the kitchen table. Lucia did not look at her, which was a form of mercy. How did your husband meet Carlo? Nora asked. Lucia stirred without pausing. He didn't say which husband. My father, Adrian. Lucia reached for a jar on the shelf above the stove. Her movements were precise, practiced, the choreography of a woman who had made this particular dish 1,000 times and could do it while carrying on any conversation without losing the thread. Your father was the lead structural engineer on a waterfront development in New Orleans, she said. 1989. Carlo had interests in the property. Not the legitimate kind, but not the worst kind either. He was at that point in his life, somewhere between what he had been and what he was trying to become. Your father discovered that the developer, not Carlo, someone above Carlo, had falsified the load-bearing assessments for the foundation. The building was supposed to be a 20-story residential complex. The foundation was built for 12. Nora's hands flattened on the table. Your father went to the city inspector, Lucia continued. He had documentation, everything. He was prepared to blow the entire project open, but the developer had connections, and within 48 hours, your father had received the kind of encouragement that usually ends careers. Carlo found out. He intervened. She paused. Not for your father, for the people who would have lived in that building when the foundation failed. What did he do? He made sure the right information reached the right people without your father's name attached to it. He absorbed the cost of the project's cancellation, financially and otherwise. Your father kept his career. She tasted the sauce, adjusted something, continued stirring. They met once. Afterward, Carlo told him what he'd done and why. Your father asked what he could do in return. Carlo said nothing. Your father said that wasn't an answer. She allowed herself a small private smile. Carlo said, if either of us ever falls into darkness, the other stands beside them. It was romantic in its way, the kind of promise men make when they've just realized that decency is rarer than money. Nora was quiet for a long time. The onions had softened and the sauce was beginning to smell like something she'd eaten in another life. A dinner party, maybe, or a restaurant that no longer existed. Carlo died, she said finally. It wasn't a question. 3 years ago, heart. Lucia's voice carried the flatness of a grief thoroughly processed. He was not a good man in all the ways that matter, but he kept his promises. And Dominic. Dominic has spent his life carrying his father's legacy. Some of it is worth carrying. She turned from the stove and looked at Nora directly for the first time during the conversation. Some of it is a cage he has not yet decided to leave. Nora heard footsteps on the stairs. Dominic's particular cadence, unhurried and precise. Lucia turned back to the stove. He came into the kitchen carrying his phone and wearing the expression of a man who had just received information that confirmed an existing theory but made everything worse. Grant's attorney filed an emergency injunction at 6 a.m., he said, claiming the architectural files were stolen proprietary data. The filing named you. He can't. Those files were shared with me legitimately. The resort's management authorized my access months ago. The resort's management, as of this morning, is under new control. Meridian acquired the emergency receivership through a shell company that filed during the storm. They now control the resort's legal identity and all associated intellectual property. The kitchen was very quiet. In other words, Nora said slowly, the very files I'm holding as evidence of their crime are now legally their property, and my possessing them is theft. That's their argument, yes. Which means if I walk into a federal office with them, you're potentially walking into a property dispute that their lawyers can drag through the courts for 18 months, while the actual criminal charges get buried in procedural motions. She pressed both palms flat on the table, the cold plastic of the waterproof pouch pressed against her sternum like a second heartbeat. Catherine Reeves, she said. Call her now. I already did. She knows we're coming, but Nora... He stopped, set the phone on the table, sat down across from her, which was something he hadn't done before. All their conversations had happened standing, in motion, or at a deliberate distance. This felt different. Meridian has people looking. The injunction created a paper trail. They know we're on the mainland. They know the general area. How general? General enough that staying here overnight significantly increases the risk. Where then? His eyes held hers. There was something in them. Not hesitation. He wasn't a man who hesitated, but a kind of deliberateness, the awareness that the next thing he said was going to change the parameters of everything between them. Catherine Reeves is in Chicago. The task force's secured facility is there. I have transportation that can get us there in 18 hours by a route that Meridian can't easily track. But it means committing, completely, to traveling together, trusting each other's judgment completely, for the duration. No separate decisions. No calls made independently. If either of us acts alone, we compromise the other. You're asking me to trust you. I'm telling you what the situation requires. Same thing. Maybe. Lucia set 2 bowls on the table without comment and returned to the stove. Nora looked at the food and realized she was desperately hungry. The deep structural hunger of a body that had been running on adrenaline and damage for 20 hours and was now demanding settlement. She picked up the fork. "Tell me something true," she said. "Something you haven't told me because it changes how I see you, not because it's tactically useful." Dominic was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain against the windows was steady and ordinary, the kind of rain that existed everywhere in the world simultaneously and didn't care about any particular crisis. "My family's operations on this coastline are the reason Meridian targeted this region," he said. "Not directly, but our presence created the power vacuum that attracted them. The deals my father made, the structures he built, some of them were specifically designed to keep certain types of development out of these islands. When Carlo died, some of those structures collapsed. People read it as opportunity." He paused. "The corruption that destroyed this resort, that put you in a flooded hallway last night, it has roots in decisions my father made, and I let continue, and have not yet fully dismantled." Nora chewed. Thought. Looked at the man across the table. "That's a significant thing to admit to someone you're asking to trust you," she said. "Yes." "Why tell me?" "Because you asked for something true. And because you're carrying evidence that could end something that started with my family's failures, and you have a right to know the full picture of what you're in the middle of." She thought about her father, about a foundation built wrong in New Orleans, and a promise made between men who'd both spent their lives in moral ambiguity. One building things, one running things, both trying in their incomplete, flawed ways to do something worth doing in the end. She thought about Grant, about the systematic architecture of his betrayal, every piece placed with deliberation over months or years, and the exhausting revelation that the person you know best can be fundamentally unknown. She thought about the drive against her sternum, its cold weight, the evidence it carried. "Chicago," she said. Dominic nodded. "We leave tonight," she said, "before the storm comes back." And they would have. They should have. The car was ready, the route was planned. Valeria had confirmed the transport from a connection 2 towns over. Everything was in order, except that at 7:43 in the evening, as the sky darkened and the back wall of Hurricane Marin gathered itself offshore, and Sal was loading the last bags into the SUV, Nora opened her laptop to pull a file she needed for the meeting with Reeves. Something from her professional portfolio that documented the original authorized access to the resort's architectural database, and found that her hard drive had been remotely accessed, not hacked, accessed, with her own login credentials used from an IP address in Seattle that belonged, according to the network trace Marco ran in under 4 minutes, to the offices of the law firm that represented Grant Mercer's corporate consulting business. They'd copied her entire design portfolio, her client files, her personal documents, and the metadata on her authorized access to the resort's architectural database had been altered, timestamps changed, authorization codes removed, the digital record of her legitimate consulting relationship with the resort's management retroactively erased. She stared at the screen, felt the floor shift again. Grant was thorough. She had to give him that. While she was surviving a hurricane, he had been methodically deleting the evidence of her innocence from every system she owned. She was no longer a whistleblower with authorized access to protected files. On paper, she was a thief. She looked up at Dominic, who had read the situation from her face before she said a word. "They've altered the authorization records," she said. "Every piece of evidence that I accessed those files legitimately, it's gone." Catherine Reeves won't care about the paper trail, Dominic said immediately. She has her own. But a defense attorney will, Nora said. And every journalist covering the story will. And any federal judge evaluating the admissibility of the evidence will. Without proof that I was authorized, I'm not a witness. I'm a defendant. The room was silent. Sal paused in the doorway with a bag in each hand. Nora pressed her fingertips against the laptop keys and thought about her father, about structures built on bad foundations, about the terrible patience of corruption, about how it waited and waited and waited until you had exactly one move left, and then it took that from you too. She closed the laptop. There's a backup, she said. Paper. Original paper correspondence between my father and the resort's management, from when he first pitched the architectural concept. Documentation of the relationship between our family and this property going back 23 years. Authorization that predates everything Grant touched and everything Meridian bought. She paused. It's in a storage unit in Seattle. Seattle, Dominic said. Yes. That's not on the route to Chicago. No, she said. It's not. Outside, the first edge of the hurricane's back wall was beginning to make itself known. A low subsonic pressure change, the barometric drop of something enormous preparing to arrive. The windows flexed slightly. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked. Dominic looked at Nora. She looked at him. We need to split the route, he said, and in the way he said it, she could hear the thing he wasn't saying, that splitting the route meant splitting the group, that splitting the group meant each of them carrying a different piece of the solution, that it would mean trusting each other completely and separately, without the ability to verify, and that this was exactly what Grant and Meridian and the 6 armed men who had come ashore on a hurricane-battered island had been engineering toward since before any of them landed on this island. The trap wasn't the armed men. The armed men were just the mechanism. The trap was this moment, this precise geometry of need where the only path forward required each of them to be completely, irrevocably vulnerable to the other. Chicago for the files, Nora said. Seattle for the proof. One of us in each direction. Yes. He didn't answer immediately. The storm pressed against the windows. Lucia appeared in the kitchen doorway, reading the room with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms in which her family's survival was under discussion. Dominic, she said softly. And in the way she said his name, not a warning, not a command, just the anchoring sound of it, Nora understood that the old woman had known from the beginning where this was going, that some part of this had been arranged long before any of them understood the arrangement, and that the promise made between 2 imperfect men in New Orleans in 1989 was about to be paid in full by their children, in a small yellow house on a storm-battered coast, with the evidence of one crime and the ghost of another pressing down on all of them like weight on a bad foundation. Nora stood up from the table. She picked up the laptop, tucked it under her arm, and pressed her other hand flat against the pouch beneath her shirt. The drive still there, still cold. I'll go to Seattle, she said, alone. No. Dominic's voice was immediate, no deliberation. Sal goes with you. Your people are known. If Meridian is tracking your network, Sal has a clean identity, no connection to my family's name. He's a courier, on paper, has been for 6 years. He looked at Sal, who had set the bags down and was waiting with the stillness of a man accustomed to having his life redirected mid-sentence. Seattle. The storage unit. You bring back whatever she tells you to bring back, and you bring her back with it. Sal nodded once. And you? Nora asked Dominic. Chicago, with the drive. Catherine Reeves needs the files in her hands before Meridian's attorneys file a second injunction. We have maybe 36 hours before that window closes. Nora looked at him, at the scar along his jaw, at the hands that had pulled a steel beam off her spine in a flooded hallway, at the face of a man she had known for less than 24 hours, and trusted more than the man she'd slept beside for 5 years, which was either the most rational decision she'd ever made or the most catastrophic, and she genuinely could not tell which. If you hand those files to Reeves before I get back with the authorization documents, she said, I'm still exposed, legally. They can still build the case that I stole them. I know. So you're asking me to trust that you'll wait. I'm asking you to trust that I understand what's at stake for you, and that I do not make promises I don't keep. Lucia made a small sound from the doorway. Not commentary, just presence, the specific, weighted presence of a woman confirming without words that her son was telling the truth about the one thing that mattered. Nora exhaled, long and slow through her nose the way her therapist had taught her. 4 counts in, 7 out, hold the center. 72 hours, she said. I'll be in Chicago in 72 hours. I'll be there. She picked up her bag. Sal picked up his. They moved toward the door, and the storm outside pushed against the house like something that had been waiting a long time for permission to enter. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't look back, but she said, quietly, to the room and to the man still standing in it, "My father built things meant to last. Don't let them bury it." The door closed behind her, and the hurricane came back. The flight to Seattle cost Sal 40 minutes of quiet phone work and a credit card that had no name Nora recognized. They drove to a regional airstrip 20 minutes inland from the safe house, where a 6-seat prop plane was already running its engines in the rain like it had been waiting since before they knew they needed it. No terminal, no check-in, no questions. Just a pilot who nodded at Sal and didn't look at Nora and pointed at the 2 rear seats with the professional indifference of a man who had made a career of not knowing things. She slept on the plane, not because she was calm, but because her body had reached the outer edge of its operating capacity and simply switched off without asking permission. She woke when the wheels hit the tarmac at a private field outside Tacoma, and for 2 full seconds she didn't know where she was or what year it was, and then it all came back. Grant, Simone, the cabana, the flood, the drive against her sternum, the hurricane, a man with a scarred jaw and careful hands, and the weight of it settled back onto her chest like a physical thing. Seattle in February. Cold the way Seattle was cold. Not dramatic, not brutal, just persistent. A damp that got into everything and stayed. The kind of cold that matched her current internal weather exactly, which she noted without irony. Sal drove. He'd acquired a rental car at the field through a process Nora didn't observe and didn't ask about. He drove the way he did everything, quietly, efficiently, with an awareness of his mirrors that was habitual rather than paranoid. "How long have you worked for him?" she asked. 11 years. Since you were, what, 17? 18. A pause. He got my brother out of a situation in Naples. I owed him. And after 11 years, are you still paying the debt, or did it become something else? Sal glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Something else," he said. After a moment, "He doesn't ask us to do things we'd be ashamed of. That's rarer than it sounds in our line." Nora thought about that. She thought about it the way you think about something that's simultaneously comforting and deeply insufficient, true enough to matter, not true enough to be clean. The storage facility was in Soto, south of downtown, a 3-story concrete building with the anonymous face of every storage facility in every city, designed to blend into the industrial landscape like a very large gray secret. Nora had rented the unit 8 years ago, originally to store furniture from her first apartment when she'd moved in with Grant. Over time, it had become something else. An archive, really, of her father's professional life. After Adrian Ellison died, she'd brought boxes of his papers, drawings, correspondence, and files back to Seattle rather than let them be scattered or discarded, and she'd never had the emotional capacity to sort through them properly. And so they'd sat here in Unit 247 in their labeled banker's boxes while she built a life on top of her grief and pretended she'd dealt with it. She hadn't dealt with it. She was dealing with it now, under the worst possible circumstances, which was apparently the only way she knew how to do anything. The facility's night manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the resigned authority of someone who had seen every kind of person arrive at every kind of hour carrying every kind of burden, checked her unit number, confirmed her access code, and buzzed them through without looking up from his desk. Nora had the irrational thought that this man was the most normal human being she had encountered in 4 days, and the normalcy of him was almost unbearable. Unit 247 was on the 2nd floor. The elevator smelled like industrial cleaner and rust, which was becoming a motif she could have done without. The roll-up door stuck at the bottom the way it always had. She had to grip the handle with both hands and yank, a specific jerk, and lift combination she'd developed over years of visits. Inside, boxes, stacked and labeled in her own handwriting from years ago. Her father's drafting tools in a hard case. A framed architectural rendering she'd never been able to bring herself to hang. 2 filing cabinets, locked. The keys on her keyring. She found the box labeled Ellison Projects 1985 to 1992 in the second row. Pulled it out, set it on the floor. The tape she'd used to seal it had yellowed and dried and came off in crumbling strips when she broke the seal. Inside them, folders. Dozens of them. The legal-size manila kind her father had used his entire career, each one labeled in his particular handwriting. Precise, architectural lettering, every character formed as if it might be load-bearing. She found Harbor View Resort, development correspondence near the bottom of the box. Her hands were shaking slightly as she opened it. Not from cold, from something else, the proximity of her father's handwriting, the paper that had passed through his hands in a year. She would have been 7 years old. The smell of old documents that was somehow also the smell of a specific memory. His study, Saturday mornings, the sound of his drafting pencil against vellum. She pressed her teeth together and focused. The folder contained what she'd hoped it would. Original correspondence between Adrian Ellison and the resort's founding management, letters, signed contracts, authorization forms granting his firm ongoing access to the property's structural data for maintenance consultation. The relationship had been continuous, professionally documented, renewed every 5 years per the contract terms. The last renewal letter, signed by the resort's board, was dated 14 months ago. Her father's name was on it. Her firm's name, Ellison Design Associates, which she had inherited and continued after his death, was on it. Her own signature was on the renewal, as his successor and the firm's principal. Legitimate access, documented on paper, that predated any digital system Grant or Meridian could have touched. She photographed every page with her phone. She put the originals back in the folder, put the folder in her bag, and sat back on her heels on the concrete floor of Unit 247 and breathed. "You found it," Sal said from the doorway. "Yes?" "We should move. It's almost 4 a.m. She started to stand, and then her eye caught something else in the box. A folder she didn't recognize. Not her handwriting on the label. Her father's. Carlo D. Personal. 1989. She knew she should leave. She knew every minute in this building was a minute of exposure, and Sal was right about the time, and Dominic was in Chicago waiting, and the 36-hour window was burning down. She opened the folder. Inside was a single letter, handwritten on hotel stationery from a New Orleans property that had probably been demolished decades ago. The handwriting was not her father's. It was dense, deliberate, and it took her 40 seconds to read it in full. When she finished, she read it again, more slowly. Then she sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit and stared at the wall while Sal watched her from the doorway with the careful stillness of a man who understood that something had just changed. "Sal," she said. Her voice was very level. "Did Dominic tell you why he went to that resort specifically?" "His mother wanted a vacation. She grew up near the coast. Did he tell you about the resort's ownership structure?" A pause. "No." "Did he mention a company called Pacific Meridian Holdings, different from Meridian Coastal Development? The parent company, 3 levels up." Another pause. Longer. "I don't know that name." Nora looked down at the letter in her hands. Carlo DeLuca's handwriting, 1989, describing a conversation with her father on a New Orleans evening after the foundation scandal had been resolved. The letter was what Lucia had described, a record of the promise, the commitment between 2 men. But there was a paragraph at the end that Lucia had not mentioned, and that Nora suspected Lucia might not know existed. In it, Carlo described an investment. A gesture of solidarity, he called it. A silent stake, small, minority, untraceable, taken in Adrian Ellison's architectural firm after the New Orleans incident as a way of ensuring the firm's survival if the industry backlash from the foundation scandal had long-term consequences. It was never disclosed to Adrian, Carlo wrote. It was meant to be dissolved quietly once the crisis passed. But then Adrian had taken on the Harbor View Resort Commission, and the stake had migrated into the project's founding investment structure. And by the time Carlo had tried to unwind it, The legal architecture was complex enough that moving it would have created more noise than leaving it. The DeLuca family held a dormant, undisclosed fractional ownership stake in the original Harborview Resort development. It had never been disclosed. Not to her father, not to any regulatory body, not to the resort's subsequent management, and certainly not to Nora. The stake was small, but it was real. And if Meridian's attorneys found it, when they found it, because they were already in the resort's records, it would not look like a historical oversight. It would look like Dominic DeLuca had a direct financial interest in the property, whose stolen blueprints he was now delivering to a federal prosecutor. It would look like he was cleaning up his own family's liability, destroying the competition while protecting himself. Using Nora, using the legitimacy of her victimhood, the clean optics of a betrayed wife with authorized access, as cover for an operation that had his family's fingerprints on the foundation. She sat with this for 90 seconds, counted her breaths, made herself be fair, made herself consider the possibility that Dominic didn't know, that Carlo had kept the stake buried deep enough that his son had no awareness of it, that the concealment had been thorough enough to survive 3 decades and a father's death. She made herself consider it. Then she set it aside because whether Dominic knew or didn't know, the consequence was the same. When this came to light, and it would compromise every piece of evidence she was carrying. Defense attorneys would argue the entire operation was a self-interested criminal enterprise cleaning up its own exposure. Catherine Reeves's case would collapse. Grant would walk. Meridian would regroup. And Nora would be left holding the wreckage of a second conspiracy, this one wearing the face of the man who'd pulled her out of the flood. "We need to call him," she said. "It's 4 a.m. Call him." Sal pulled out his phone, dialed, waited. The call went to a message service. Not voicemail, just a tone, the kind of line that absorbed calls without confirming receipt. "Try another number," Nora said. "That's the only number I have for him on this operation." She stood up, put the letter in her bag with the authorization documents. Her hands were steady. She'd moved past shaking into something colder and more functional. The specific clarity of a person who has been betrayed twice in 4 days and has consequently stopped expecting safety from anything. "How long to Chicago by road?" she asked. "Driving straight? 30 hours. But he said, "How long by air?" 4 hours, maybe 5 with a connection. "Find a flight. Commercial this time. I don't care. Use whatever card you have. Put it in my name. I don't care about the trail anymore." She zipped her bag. "And call Valeria." Sal's eyebrows moved slightly. "She works for Dominic. She works for herself. She works for whoever's money is cleanest and whose plan is most likely to succeed." Nora looked at him. "Do you think she knows about the stake?" A long pause. Sal was running calculations she couldn't see. "No," he said. "Valeria's professional. If she'd known about an undisclosed ownership position, she'd have flagged it as a liability." "Then call her. Tell her I need an independent read on something before I hand anything to Reeves. Tell her it's urgent, and tell her I'll explain when we're in the same room." Sal dialed. The storage unit was cold and the light was fluorescent, and her father's boxes surrounded her in labeled rows. All those years of careful documentation, all that evidence of a man who had believed that building things honestly was its own form of protection. She wondered what he would have made of this. She wondered if he'd have had the same capacity for betrayal as everyone else, if she'd just never lived long enough to find it. She thought she probably had been lucky in that one specific way. The first flight to Chicago departed at 6:15 a.m. They were at SeaTac by 5:30, moving through the terminal with the hollow-eyed efficiency of people who had stopped sleeping as a lifestyle choice. Sal stayed close, but not close enough to look like an escort, and Nora moved through the airport with her bag slung across her body and the waterproof pouch under her shirt and the letter in her bag and a feeling in her chest that she refused to name yet because naming it would make it real. She called Dominic from a payphone near the gate because she didn't want the call on her cell's record. The line rang 6 times and went to the same silent service. She called again. 6 rings. Nothing. She hung up the receiver and stood looking at the departures board while the gate around her filled with early morning travelers carrying coffee and rolling suitcases, and the blank faces of people who hadn't yet decided what kind of day they were having. Normal people going normal places for normal reasons, and she stood among them like a fracture in a window, still holding its shape, but one pressure away from coming apart entirely. Sal appeared at her elbow. "Valeria's in Chicago already. She got there last night. Dominic sent her ahead to secure the meeting with Reeves. Can she get a message to Reeves before we land, without going through Dominic?" "She said she can try. She wants to know what the message is." Nora thought about how to compress it, about how to take something this complicated and reduce it to something that could travel through a third party without losing its essential shape. She thought about her father, about how he used to say that any structure could be reduced to its load-bearing elements if you stripped everything ornamental away. "Tell Reeves that the evidence delivery has a complication, a potential conflict of interest on the delivery side that she needs to evaluate independently before accepting the files. Tell her I'll explain in person and that I'm asking her to hold the meeting until I arrive. Don't proceed without me." Sal relayed it quietly into the phone. They boarded the plane. Nora took the window seat and pressed her forehead against the cold plastic of the porthole and watched the Seattle skyline disappear under cloud cover, and felt the altitude change in her ears, and thought about Dominic DeLuca in a Chicago facility, sitting across from a federal prosecutor, with a drive full of evidence and a family secret buried in the resort's foundation paperwork that could detonate everything she was trying to build. She thought about Lucia's face in the kitchen, that deep, unsentimental compassion, the look of a woman who had seen people receive bad news. Had Lucia known? Had the letter been her father's private insurance? Something he'd found after Carlo's death? Something he'd kept without knowing what to do with it? Or had he gone to his grave not knowing the full shape of the arrangement that had saved him? The plane leveled at cruising altitude. Sal was asleep in the aisle seat within minutes, the skill of a man who slept whenever conditions allowed. Nora opened her bag and looked at the letter again. Carlo's handwriting. Deliberate. The handwriting of a man confessing something to paper because he couldn't confess it to a living person. Her phone had signal for another 30 seconds before the altitude killed it. In those 30 seconds, one message came through, from a number she didn't recognize, a Chicago area code. It said, "He knows about the stake, has known since Carlo died. He's been trying to unwind it for 3 years. The attorney handling it is the same attorney Grant Mercer used to file the injunction this morning." She read it twice. The signal died. She sat with the message and felt the geometry of it click into place like something terrible and elegant, the specific sensation of a trap revealing its full dimensions just as you step into its center. Grant's attorney and Dominic's attorney were the same person, which meant someone had built a bridge between them, which meant the information flowing between Meridian and the DeLuca family's legal exposure had been coordinated, and the coordination had a single point, and that point was somewhere between Chicago and Seattle, and she was on a plane between them with the evidence in her shirt and the authorization in her bag, and no way to make a phone call for the next 4 hours. She closed her eyes. She thought about what her father used to say about load-bearing elements, about stripping away everything ornamental until you found the thing that was actually holding the structure up. She ran the entire sequence in her mind, from the resort to the cabana to the flooded hallway to the safe house to the storage unit, and she stripped away every feeling, every interpretation, every assumption, until she found the one thing she was certain of. The drive was real. The files were real. The authorization documents were real. And Catherine Reeves was a federal prosecutor who had spent 4 years building toward this moment. Everything else, every complication, every betrayal, every hidden stake and shared attorney and conflicted interest was ornamental. Structure built around the one thing that mattered. She opened her eyes. If Grant's attorney was the same as Dominic's attorney, then someone had been playing both sides. And if that someone had tipped her off via an anonymous Chicago number, then someone else was playing a third side that she hadn't mapped yet. And if Dominic had known about the stake for 3 years and spent those 3 years trying to unwind it through an attorney who turned out to be in Grant's pocket, then either Dominic had been played as thoroughly as she had, or he had been playing a game inside a game that she was only now beginning to see the shape of. She needed to be in that room with Reeves before Dominic got there. She needed to get there first, and she needed to tell everything, including the stake, including the attorney, including every piece of information that compromised the people helping her. And she needed to do it with the full documentation in her hands before anyone else got to shape the narrative. She looked at her watch. 3 hours and 40 minutes to Chicago O'Hare. She reached forward, opened the tray table, and began writing on the back of the boarding pass. Names, dates, connections, every structural element she could identify. Because if the plane landed and something went wrong in the next 4 hours, she needed the case to exist somewhere outside her own head. The handwriting was her father's. She hadn't noticed until she was halfway through the first line, but there it was. The same precise architectural lettering, every character formed as if it might be load-bearing. She'd inherited it without meaning to. She wrote faster. Outside, the country moved beneath them in the dark. Dark farmland, dark highways, the distant lights of cities that didn't know her name and didn't care what she was carrying. And somewhere ahead, Chicago was waiting with a federal prosecutor and a man she might not be able to trust, and a meeting that was going to determine whether the last 4 days had meant anything at all, or whether she was just the cleanest piece of a dirty machine that had been running long before she arrived and would keep running long after she was gone, if she let it. She didn't intend to let it. The plane touched down at O'Hare at 10:47 a.m. Central Time. Gray sky, February cold, the kind of wind that came off Lake Michigan like it had a personal grievance. Nora was on her feet before the seatbelt sign clicked off, bag across her body, boarding pass covered in her father's handwriting folded into her jacket pocket. Sal was already on his phone. He listened for 20 seconds, said nothing, and hung up. "Valeria," he said. "Dominic's meeting with Reeves was moved up. It starts in 40 minutes. "Where?" "Federal Building on Dearborn, 23rd floor. "How far?" 30 minutes without traffic. "Get a car." They moved through the terminal at a pace that was 1 degree below running, fast enough to cover ground, slow enough not to attract airport security. Nora's mind was running the sequence. 40 minutes, 30 to get there. 10 minutes to get through federal building security and reach the 23rd floor. The math was brutal but survivable. Outside, Sal had a car waiting in under 4 minutes. She didn't ask how. In the back seat, she called Valeria directly from Sal's phone. "Tell me you haven't let that meeting start," Nora said. "I've been stalling." Valeria's voice was flat and professional. "I told Reeves there was a documentation issue. She's not happy. Dominic is less happy. How far out are you?" 25 minutes. "I can give you 20. "Give me 22. She hung up. The city moved past the windows. The dense, indifferent architecture of Chicago pressing in from both sides of the expressway. All that steel and concrete built by people who had believed in permanence. She pressed her hand against the pouch at her sternum and felt the drive's hard edge through the fabric and thought about her father's letter, about load-bearing elements, about the thing that was actually holding this entire structure up. The federal building on Dearborn was exactly what it was supposed to be. Heavy, institutional, built to make you feel the weight of consequence before you even walked through the door. Security took 6 minutes. The elevator took 2 more. She walked through the door of conference room 2312 at exactly the 22-minute mark. Dominic was already seated across from a sharp-faced woman in her mid-40s, Catherine Reeves, who had the specific composure of someone who had spent years in rooms where people lied and had developed an immune system for it. He looked up when Nora entered, and in his face she saw something she hadn't expected. Not guilt, not calculation, but the raw, unguarded expression of a man who had been afraid she wasn't coming. She set her bag on the table. She took out the authorization documents and Carlo's letter and the boarding pass covered in her father's handwriting. "I'll explain everything," she said to Reeves. "All of it, including the parts that complicate his position." She didn't look at Dominic when she said it. "But I need you to hear it before anyone else speaks." Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then she folded her hands on the table. "Start from the beginning," she said. And Nora did. Catherine Reeves listened the way federal prosecutors listened, without expression, without interruption, without any of the social signaling that normal humans use to indicate they were following along. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes moving between Nora's face and the documents on the table, and she absorbed everything with the flat, comprehensive attention of a recording device that also happened to be making judgments. It took 41 minutes. Nora knew because she watched the clock on the conference room wall and timed herself, forcing the account into chronological order despite every instinct to jump ahead, to get to the parts that felt most urgent. She started with the resort consultation, the authorized access, the USB drive. She moved through the hurricane, the abandonment, the evacuation. She covered Dominic's intervention without editorializing. She presented Carlo's letter and the dormant stake and the shared attorney with the same flat delivery she used for everything else. Because the moment she started deciding what to emphasize, she became a narrator with an agenda instead of a witness with evidence. Dominic sat across the table and did not speak. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, not clenched, not restless, just present. He watched Nora with the expression of a man hearing a story he already knew told by someone who understood it differently than he did, and finding that the difference mattered. When she finished, Reeves was quiet for 30 seconds. "The attorney," Reeves said. "Daniel Voss." "Yes." "He filed Grant Mercer's injunction at 6 a.m. yesterday morning." "Yes." "And he has been handling the unwinding of the DeLuca stake in the resort's founding structure for approximately 3 years. Dominic's jaw tightened. "He was recommended through a financial intermediary. I had no reason to believe Mr. DeLuca." Reeves's voice was not unkind, but it had the quality of a door closing. "I'll come to you." She looked back at Nora. The anonymous text. Chicago area code. Unknown number. "I don't know who sent it." Reeves glanced at the agent seated against the wall, a young woman who had been so still for the past 40 minutes that Nora had almost forgotten she was there. The agent left the room without a word. Reeves looked at the authorization documents again. She picked up Carlo's letter, read it a second time, set it down. "The files," she said. Nora reached under her shirt and removed the waterproof pouch. She unsealed it, placed the USB drive on the table between them, and withdrew her hand. For a moment, no one moved. Then Reeves picked it up. "I need 2 hours with my technical team," she said. "Authentication, chain of custody documentation, preliminary assessment." She stood. "Both of you stay in this building. Don't use your phones. Don't contact anyone outside this floor." She looked at Dominic specifically. "Mr. DeLuca, the stake situation is a problem. Not an insurmountable one, but a problem. My office will need a full accounting of what you knew and when. If that accounting is honest, it becomes a complication. If it isn't..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She left. The young agent came back in and stood near the door with the specific posture of someone whose job was to ensure that stay in this building was understood as a directive rather than a suggestion. The conference room was quiet. Nora sat down for the first time since she'd walked in. The chair was standard government issue. Hard, slightly too low, the kind of chair designed to remind you that comfort was not the point. She felt the exhaustion hit her in a wave, the particular crashing weight of adrenaline finally metabolizing, and she pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed through it. "Voss," she said. "I didn't know," Dominic said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not defensiveness, but the controlled anger of a man who has discovered a specific kind of betrayal and is deciding what to do with it. "Tell me you had some way of knowing." He came through Marcus Elroy, a financial attorney I've used for 15 years. "I had no reason..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "Elroy is also Meridian's outside counsel for Caribbean property acquisitions." Nora stared at him. "I found out this morning," he said. "An hour before you walked through that door. That's why you moved the meeting up. I was trying to get the files to Reeves before Voss could file a second injunction, before whatever bridge Elroy built between my operation and Meridian could be used to challenge the evidence. So you were going to hand her the files without telling her about the stake." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm it. "Dominic, I was going to disclose the stake after the files were authenticated and in federal custody, where they couldn't be pulled back. That's not the same as telling her everything before she made decisions based on incomplete..." "I know what it is." His voice was quiet and hard. "I know exactly what it is. I'm not asking you to excuse it." She looked at him across the government table with its laminate surface and its water ring stains from 1,000 previous meetings. She thought about what Lucia had said. Some of it is a cage he has not yet decided to leave. She thought about the man who had pulled a steel beam off her spine and dressed a wound on her arm with surgical precision and told her the truth about his family's failures at a kitchen table in a yellow house while the hurricane came back. She thought about how the line between protection and control looked exactly the same from the outside until you were close enough to feel which way the pressure was running. "It was still the wrong call," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was." The simplicity of the admission stopped her. She'd been braced for justification, for the architecture of rationalization that men like him, men who moved through the world with that particular gravity of accumulated power, usually constructed around their choices. Instead, she got two words, and silence, and the specific quality of a person who had decided not to defend the indefensible. She looked away first. The 2 hours stretched. Sal brought coffee from a machine in the hallway, the kind that was aggressively bad in a way that was almost comforting. Nora drank it and stared at the city through the conference room window. Chicago in winter, all gray water and gray sky and the brutal elegance of the loop steel geometry against the clouds. Her father had loved this city. He'd done 3 projects here in the early 90s, had talked about its architecture the way other men talked about music, with a reverence that was also personal, like the buildings said something about the people who built them that the people themselves couldn't articulate. She was still at the window when Reeves came back. 93 minutes, not 2 hours, which either meant the authentication had gone faster than expected or something had happened that changed the timeline. The expression on Reeves's face told her it was the second thing. "The files are authenticated," Reeves said, sitting down and opening a folder that hadn't existed before. "Military-grade encryption intact. The metadata corroborates the chain of custody you described. The authorization documents match the resort's pre-Meridian records, which my office has had under preservation order for 14 months. She looked at Nora. "You're not a defendant. You're a material witness, and as of 40 minutes ago, a protected one." Nora exhaled. Something loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized was still clenched. "Grant Mercer," Reeves continued, "was taken into federal custody at 11:15 this morning at O'Hare International Airport. He was attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands." The room was very still. "He had a secondary drive," Reeves said. "Partial files, the reconstructed copies, not the originals. His intention was to complete the sale offshore and trigger the project's development phase before we could freeze the assets." She paused. "He also had Simone Alcazar with him. She has agreed to cooperate with the investigation." Nora absorbed this. She thought she'd feel something more dramatic, triumph, or the specific satisfaction of a wrong being righted. Instead, she felt the quiet flatness of a conclusion that had been inevitable once the evidence was real and in federal hands. Grant in custody was not justice. It was the beginning of a process that would take months or years and grind through courts and appeals and legal machinery that moved with the deliberate, impersonal momentum of a system that didn't care about the human cost of what it processed. It was the right outcome. It was not a relief. "The development syndicate," Dominic said. "The buyers." Reeves looked at him with an expression that recalibrated slightly. 3 of the 4 primary buyers are within U.S. jurisdiction. Arrest warrants are being processed. The 4th is offshore. We're working with Interpol. She glanced at her folder. "The observation tower on the island, the planned exchange site." "What about it?" Nora asked. "Meridian's operation team was using it as a staging point for the final digital transfer, the point at which the originals would be authenticated against the reconstructed copies, and the full payment would be released. With Mercer in custody and the originals in our possession, that transfer can't happen, but Meridian's people on the ground don't know that yet." Reeves looked between them. "They're still on the island. The tower. 4 men, possibly 5, with the buyer's financial representative and enough encrypted transfer equipment to complete a 9-figure transaction." "The island was evacuated," Dominic said. "The guests were evacuated. Meridian's operation team sheltered in the tower during the storm. The structure held—" "Your father built it well," she said to Nora, and the acknowledgement was brief and factual, and landed with more weight than any elaboration would have. "They've been out of communication since the storm's back wall hit. When they re-establish contact and discover the transaction has collapsed, they will attempt to destroy the evidence and extract." "How long?" Dominic asked. Weather window opens in approximately 4 hours. After that, they have extraction options. She closed the folder. I have a tactical team staged at the mainland port, but the tower's structural layout is complex. Your father designed it with integrated security systems that my team has incomplete maps of. She looked at Nora directly. You have the full architectural package. The understanding arrived before the question did. Nora felt it settle into her with the cold clarity of a decision that wasn't really a choice, the kind of moment that presented itself as an option while making clear there was only one direction. You want me to go back, Nora said. I want your expertise on the building's systems, remote guidance for my team's approach. Reeves paused. Or in person, if you're willing. The tactical team knows how to move. They don't know how the building thinks. Dominic's hand was on the table between them, not touching her but present. No, he said to Reeves with a quiet finality that was not negotiable. It's her decision, Reeves said. She's been through Dominic. Nora said his name the way Lucia had said it in the yellow house. Not a command, just an anchor. He stopped. She thought about the drive, about the files it had held for 4 days against her sternum, about the resort her father had designed with the specific intent that it should last, that it should be worth lasting, that the coastline it sat on was worth protecting, about Grant, who had used her as a mule and erased her and sent armed men, and was now in federal custody, which was correct, but not complete. Because the men in the tower were still there, and the evidence they were trying to destroy was still connected to everything her father had built. And the idea of letting them shred it while she sat in a government conference room drinking bad coffee was something she could not make herself accept. I'll go, she said. They were in the air again by 2 in the afternoon. A Coast Guard helicopter, military spec, built for ugly weather and uglier situations. Nora sat in the cargo section with Reeves's lead tactical agent, a compact woman named Torres, who wore her competence like a second skin and had spent the flight briefing Nora on the team's approach vectors with the kind of professional efficiency that communicated. I have done this before, and I will do it again, and you will not slow me down. Nora had the architectural files open on a hardened tablet Reeves's team had loaded with the full resort blueprint package. She moved through the tower's schematics with the focused attention of someone who had spent 15 years learning to read buildings the way other people read faces. The structural logic, the hidden load paths, the places where the design revealed its maker's thinking. Her father had designed the observation tower in the resort's second phase, added a decade after the original construction as a luxury amenity. A 12-story glass and steel structure built into the natural cliff face at the island's eastern point, with panoramic views of the Caribbean and an integrated mechanical system that controlled the elevators, emergency lighting, ventilation, and the retractable storm shutters that could seal the entire structure in under 4 minutes. The storm shutters. She looked at the schematic again. Torres, she said. Torres looked up from her tactical display. The tower's storm shutters, they're motorized, independent power supply, separate from the main generator. They're designed to close automatically when the external sensor detects wind speeds above 60 miles per hour. She looked at the weather data on the tablet's secondary screen. The back wall of the storm is still generating gusts of 70 to 80 miles per hour on the eastern face of the island. Torres's eyes sharpened. Which means the shutters are currently closed. Which means anyone inside the tower is sealed in, and the shutter control override is at the base of the structure. An external panel, accessible from the maintenance level, which is below the floodline and currently underwater. She looked at Torres. They can open the shutters manually from inside, but it takes 2 people and approximately 8 minutes. So they can't extract quickly. Not without prep time. If your team is at the base before they start the manual override, they're already contained. Torres was on her radio before Nora finished the sentence, relaying coordinates and approach angles in the compressed language of someone accustomed to turning information into action in under 30 seconds. Dominic was in the seat across from her. He hadn't spoken since they'd boarded. He was watching her with that absolute unreadable attention, the way he'd watched her from the presidential wing balcony during the evacuation, when she'd been a stranger moving through ruins, and he'd been the man who decided to pull her out. You knew about the shutters before you looked at the schematic, he said. My father told me about them. He was proud of the engineering. He said a building should be able to protect itself. She looked at the tablet. He meant it literally. The island appeared through the helicopter's windscreen, devastated, stripped, the luxury resort's careful facades torn back to reveal the honest bones underneath. The main building was damaged but standing. The south wing was worse. The cabana where she'd watched her marriage end was gone, as it had been gone since the first night, and the beach where it had stood was clean and raw and strange. The tower rose from the cliff face exactly as the schematic showed, intact, the retractable shutters sealed across its glass faces, the storm's remaining winds pressing against it with the dogged persistence of weather that hadn't finished making its point. Torres's team went in from 3 directions: maintenance level, base access, and a secondary approach along the cliff face that Nora had identified as a structural inspection pathway her father had built for post-storm assessment. It wasn't on any public map. It was in the original blueprints, accessible through a panel in the cliff face marked with a specific symbol her father used on all his projects. A small, precise triangle that meant engineers' access only. She pointed it out to Torres from the helicopter. Torres relayed it. The third team found the panel in under 2 minutes. They were on the ground by the time the first shots fired. Not at them, at the water. A warning burst from inside the tower. Someone on the upper levels who had spotted the Coast Guard helicopter through a gap in the shutters and understood that the calculus had changed. The sound was flat and percussive across the open water, stripped of drama by the wind. Torres's voice in Nora's earpiece. Stay at the base. Do not move from the extraction point. Nora stayed. She stood at the base of the tower with a Coast Guard officer named Brannick, who was approximately the size of a refrigerator and had been assigned to her with the specific energy of someone who had been told, "Do not let this woman die," and had taken the instruction personally. She could hear the tactical operation moving through the building structure. Not the sounds of it, but the building's response to it. Doors opening and closing. The elevator shaft engaging and disengaging. The emergency lighting grid cycling as someone accessed the control panel on the 4th floor. She knew the building's sounds the way she knew her father's handwriting, and she tracked the operation through them while Torres gave compressed updates through the earpiece. 3rd floor clear, moving to 5. Copy. Elevator is locked. They've engaged the manual brake from above. There's a service ladder in the northwest corner of the elevator shaft, Nora said into the earpiece. Maintenance access, it bypasses the cab entirely. A pause. Confirmed. Moving. 2 tangos on 7, 1 with the transfer equipment. The transfer equipment is tied to the structural support column on the east face, Nora said. She was looking at the schematic on the tablet, tracing the tower's internal geography from memory and blueprint simultaneously. The column has an integrated conduit for the building's sensor network. Fiber optic runs the full height of the tower. If they're using it to anchor the transfer equipment, they're piggybacking off the building's own communication infrastructure. Meaning what? Meaning, if you cut the conduit at the service panel on floor 3, there's an access hatch, northeast corner, marked with a red stripe. You kill their transfer capability without killing the building's emergency systems. 30 seconds of silence. Conduit cut, Torres said. Their equipment just went dark. Above her, something changed in the tower. The specific quality of the silence shifted. She could feel it in the base of her skull, the way you feel a change in air pressure before you hear it. The controlled, purposeful sounds of people executing a plan became something else, something more fractured, the sounds of people whose plan had just collapsed and were making new decisions under extreme time pressure. They're moving to the roof, Torres said. Possible extraction attempt. They may have a line rigged. The roof access hatch is externally sealed, Nora said, scanning the schematic. Storm protocol. It auto-locks from outside when the shutters close. They can't open it from inside without the override code. She found the relevant section of the blueprint. The override code is a sound from above, not a shot. Something heavier, structural. Then Torres's voice, sharp and immediate. Shutter panel on level 9 just went manual. They're trying to force an opening, says they have tools. The level 9 shutters are the weakest in the sequence, Nora said, and her voice was absolutely steady in a way that surprised her. That calm of a person operating entirely within a discipline they had spent their life developing. My father reinforced them after the original installation. There's a secondary locking mechanism, a manual deadbolt, accessible from the exterior maintenance walkway on the 9th floor. If someone can reach it from outside and engage the bolt, the shutters can't be forced from inside. The exterior walkway requires climbing the cliff face from level 6. Yes. A pause. That walkway is 8 inches wide, Torres said. I know. Another pause, longer. Nora could hear Torres running the calculation. Available personnel, position, time, the 8-inch walkway on the face of a cliff above the Caribbean with hurricane residual winds still gusting at 40 miles an hour. I have a man who can do it, Torres said, but I need someone to talk him through the bolt mechanism in real time. The schematics I have don't show the secondary installation. I know where it is, Nora said. I'll talk him through it. You sure? She looked up at the tower rising above her against the gray sky. Her father's work, still standing, still holding, still doing the thing he had designed it to do, which was survive the worst the weather could throw at it and remain intact on the other side. Tell your man to start climbing, she said. I'll be on the line. It took 11 minutes. She stood at the base of the tower with the tablet in her hands, and Brannick like a wall beside her and Torres's climber, an agent named Decker, who said exactly 3 words during the entire ascent, each one a confirmation that he had reached the next marker. Working his way up the exterior maintenance walkway while she fed him instructions in the precise, unhurried cadence of a structural designer who understood that in moments like this, clarity was the only form of courage that mattered. 90 centimeters above your right hand. You'll feel a recessed panel. The edge is beveled inward, my father's mark. Pull it straight out, not up. Got it? The bolt is behind a spring plate. Push the plate left, your left, and hold it while you rotate the bolt clockwise. Full rotation, 180 degrees. Copy. 40 seconds of silence and wind noise. Bolts engaged. Above them, the sound of the level 9 shutters, straining against tools and human force and the specific desperation of people with no exit, went quiet. A different sound replaced it, the sound of realization, of the particular silence that falls over a room when everyone in it understands simultaneously that they have run out of options. Torres's voice. Moving in on 9. Stand by. Nora lowered the tablet. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking now. Not from fear, but from the release of 40 minutes of sustained precision, the way a bow trembles after the arrow has been loosed. Brannick looked at her sideways. You good? Yes, she said. And then, no, but yes. He nodded, which was exactly the right response. 12 minutes later, Torres came down from the tower with 4 men in restraints and a 5th on a stretcher. Not dead, Torres said, but not walking either, and a hard drive containing the transaction records for 9 separate Meridian development projects across 6 countries, which Reeves's people would subsequently describe as the most comprehensive single piece of organized corruption evidence recovered in a Caribbean operation in the previous decade. The financial representatives, as a man in his 50s in what had been an expensive suit before 4 days in a storm-damaged tower had finished with it, was the last one out. He walked under his own power, flanked by Torres's agents, and as he passed Nora, he looked at her with the specific expression of a man trying to identify the variable he'd miscalculated. She looked back at him without expression. He looked away first. Dominic appeared at her elbow. He'd been at the perimeter for the entire operation, which she understood was Reeves's condition for his presence, close enough to advise, far enough that the federal operation had clean separation from his involvement. He stood beside her in the wind and looked at the tower and said nothing for a long moment. The bolt mechanism, he said. The secondary installation. It's not in any version of the blueprints I've seen. It's in the original handwritten revisions. My father added it after the first storm season. He wasn't satisfied with the primary lock's torque rating in sustained high winds. She looked at the tower. He didn't file the revision with the resort's management. He just did it because he thought the building needed it. He built in a protection that no one knew about. He built in a protection that the building needed, whether anyone knew about it or not. She paused. That was how he worked. The wind off the water was cold and salt-heavy, and it moved through her hair and her clothes, and she let it, because the alternative was to start feeling everything she had not allowed herself to feel for the last 4 days. And she wasn't ready for that yet. And she suspected she wouldn't be ready for a long time. And that was information she filed under later, along with everything else that required more of her than she currently had to give. Torres called her name from the tower's base. The Coast Guard officer beside her said something into his radio. The helicopter was coming back around from its holding pattern, the sound of its rotors growing from a distant thrum to a present weight in the chest. Dominic looked at her. In his face, she could see the same exhaustion she felt. Not the surface kind that sleep fixed, but the deeper kind. The kind that came from carrying something too heavy for too long in the wrong direction and only now beginning to understand which way was actually forward. "It's done," he said. "Almost," she said. "Reeves still needs the full deposition, the stake disclosure, all of it." "I know." "And after that," he said, "you said you'd go home and rebuild your life." The helicopter settled into its landing approach, kicking up spray from the flooded resort grounds and filling the air with noise and salt and the specific beautiful violence of a machine that existed to carry people out of impossible places. "I said that," she agreed. He looked at her with that absolute attention, the look she'd been trying to read since the first night, trying to determine whether it was calculation or something more complicated, something that lived in the space where calculation ran out and a person was left with only what they actually were. She still wasn't certain, but she was beginning to think that uncertainty, in this specific case, was not the same as danger. "After the deposition," she said, "we'll see." She walked toward the helicopter. The tower rose behind her against the gray Caribbean sky, intact, her father's work still holding, the secondary bolt engaged, the building protecting itself the way he'd designed it to, quietly, completely, and in a way that nobody had known about until the moment it mattered most. Torres held the helicopter door. Nora climbed in, strapped herself into the harness, and pressed her back against the seat as the rotors accelerated and the island fell away beneath them. Smaller and smaller, the devastated resort and the standing tower and the raw coastline her father had loved enough to build something beautiful on, shrinking to a shape and then to a line and then to nothing in the gray water. Dominic was across from her, watching the island disappear with the expression of a man closing a chapter he'd been trying to finish for 3 years. His hands were loose on his knees. The scar along his jaw caught the light from the helicopter's interior panels. Reeves's voice came through the headset. "Mercer's attorney, Voss, was taken into custody an hour ago. Elroy is cooperating. The fourth buyer's location has been confirmed to Interpol." A pause. "It's over." Nora looked at her hands, at the healed line on her forearm where the glass had gone in, at the calluses from 15 years of drafting pencils and site visits and building things that were meant to last. It wasn't over. It was finished, which was different. Finished meant the fighting had stopped, not that the damage was repaired. That part came next, and it would take longer, and it would require a different kind of strength than the kind she'd been running on for 4 days. But she had that too. She'd always had it. She just hadn't needed it yet. The mainland coast appeared on the horizon, solid and lit against the darkening sky. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 days, the darkness behind them was quiet. The deposition took 3 days. Not 3 hours, not an afternoon. 3 full days inside a federal building on Dearborn Street, in a room with no windows and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell, with Catherine Reeves and 2 of her colleagues and a court reporter whose fingers moved across the stenography machine with the relentless patience of someone who had transcribed worse things and would transcribe worse things still, and Nora sat across from them and told the complete truth from the beginning. All of it. Every piece. The resort consultation and the authorized access. The anniversary trip and the champagne and the cabana. Grant's departure before sunrise. The empty bank account. The dead phone, the stranded morning, the evacuation, the flooding corridor, the weight of debris on her spine, Dominic's intervention and the presidential wing and Lucia's kitchen and the crossing to the mainland, the storage unit, Carlo's letter, the dormant stake, Daniel Voss, the anonymous text, the flight to Chicago, The conference room and the drive placed on the table, and the decision to go back to the island. She told it chronologically, methodically, without editorializing, without making herself more heroic or more helpless than she'd actually been. When she talked about Grant, her voice was level. When she talked about her father, it wasn't. She didn't apologize for that. Reeves didn't ask her to. On the second day, Reeves's colleague, a younger man named Park, who had the precise, exhausted energy of someone 3 years into a career that was eating him alive, slid a photograph across the table. Daniel Voss, identified through his bar registration. 51 years old. Member of the Illinois Bar for 22 years. On paper, a legitimate corporate attorney with a client list that read like a prospectus for respectable commerce. Off paper, he had been routing information between Meridian's legal team and the DeLuca family's financial untangling operation for 14 months, feeding each side precisely enough of the other's positioning to keep both engaged and neither fully informed. Not working for either side. Working for the gap between them, which was where his real client lived. A third party, a development consortium based in Luxembourg that had been watching both Meridian and the DeLuca coastal interests with the patient interest of a predator, waiting for two territorial animals to exhaust each other. If Meridian had completed the transaction and the DeLuca stake had remained buried, the Luxembourg consortium would have acquired the legal liability on both sides simultaneously through a structured receivership play that Reeves's financial forensics team had identified in Voss's files. They would have owned the resort, the coastal rights, and a blackmail position over the DeLuca family's undisclosed stake, all at the same time, for a fraction of the genuine market value. Nora sat with this information and felt the specific nausea of comprehending the full architecture of a scheme that had been built around her without her knowledge. Grant had not been the architect. He had been, like her, a component, a useful piece in a structure designed by someone else. Someone with more patience and more legal sophistication and a much longer timeline. Voss's actual client, she said. We're working on it, Park said. The Luxembourg entity. 3 layers of shell incorporation. We have the structure. We're working toward the individuals. He paused. It'll take time. How much time? Reeves looked at her. Months. Maybe a year. She said it with the flat honesty of a person who had learned that sugarcoating timelines for witnesses was a form of disrespect. Grant Mercer will be prosecuted on federal fraud and conspiracy charges. That case is solid. The evidence is comprehensive. The cooperation from Alcazar and Elroy adds corroboration, and the chain of custody on the files is clean. He will go to prison. The timeline on that is 18 months to a plea, possibly less. And Meridian? The 4 buyers in custody. The offshore principal is subject to Interpol coordination. Asset freezes are in place across 6 jurisdictions. She folded her hands. The development project is dead. The coastal land reverts to its protected status under Caribbean Environmental Treaty provisions. That part is done. Nora nodded. The DeLuca stake, she said. Reeves's expression shifted slightly. Not warmer, but more deliberate. The look of a person navigating something that required precision. Mr. DeLuca's full disclosure of the stake, the circumstances of its creation, and his documented attempts to unwind it through what he believed was legitimate legal representation have been reviewed. The stake itself constitutes an undisclosed interest that should have been reported to relevant regulatory bodies at the time of the resort's licensing. She paused. However, the evidence indicates clearly that Carlo DeLuca's original concealment was motivated by the complexity of unwinding it without creating disclosure obligations that would have harmed Adrian Ellison's professional standing, not by any intent to derive benefit from the position. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one. The documentation supports it. Reeves looked at her steadily. Dominic DeLuca will pay a substantial regulatory fine. The stake will be formally dissolved. He will cooperate fully with the ongoing Luxembourg investigation. As a condition of resolution, there will be no criminal charges. She paused again. That outcome required your testimony regarding the context of Carlo's letter and the circumstances of the disclosure. Without your account, the regulatory body would have had only the undisclosed interest and no context for its origin. Nora understood what Reeves was telling her, that her decision to lay everything on the table, including the piece that complicated the man who'd helped her, had, in the end, provided the context that kept that complication from becoming a prosecution. That the truth, told completely and without strategic omission, had been its own form of protection for everyone involved. She thought about her father, about a man who had spent his career believing that honest engineering was its own argument, that if you built something correctly, its correctness would be evident, and that evidence was sufficient. He hadn't always been right about that, but he hadn't always been wrong either. On the third day, they let her go. She walked out of the federal building on Dearborn into a Chicago afternoon that was cold and bright, the kind of winter day that arrived after a string of gray ones and caught you off guard with its clarity. The lake was visible from the corner, a hard, brilliant blue that didn't match the temperature, the color of water that had decided to be beautiful regardless of the season's opinion. Sal was waiting on the sidewalk. He had coffee, real coffee, not the federal building machine variety. And he held one out to her without comment, which was the ideal response to 3 days of deposition. "Where's your car?" she asked. "I don't have one. I was going to call an Uber." She almost laughed. After everything, the helicopter, the tactical operation, the twin-engine powerboat navigating 20-foot swells, here was Sal on a Chicago sidewalk, planning to use a rideshare app like a normal person. The dissonance was so complete it was almost a relief. "Call it," she said. She flew back to Seattle the next morning, commercial, her own name, her own credit card, a new one she'd opened from her phone during the deposition's lunch break on the second day, the first financial act she'd taken entirely independently in 5 years. The account was in her name only. The card had no secondary card holder. These were small facts that shouldn't have felt significant, and did. Seattle received her the way it always did in February, with indifference and rain, the city too large and too self-possessed to register the return of any individual life. She took a cab from the airport to her apartment, let herself in, set her bag down in the hallway, and stood in the entry looking at the space she'd shared with Grant for 4 years. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like an apartment. His things were still here. Half the books, the coffee maker he'd insisted on, the framed photographs on the hallway shelf that included their wedding picture, and 2 from vacations she'd been genuinely happy on, and 1 from a New Year's party where they were both laughing at something off camera and looked, from the outside, exactly like people who were going to be fine. She took the wedding picture down. Not with anger. She'd moved through anger somewhere over the Pacific on the flight back from the island and come out the other side into something quieter and less combustible. She took it down and put it face down on the kitchen counter and made a mental note to deal with it when she had the capacity, which was not today. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table, her kitchen table. She was going to have to start thinking in those terms, reconstructing ownership of the spaces she inhabited. And she opened her laptop and looked at her professional calendar. 3 client consultations she'd missed during the week. A project proposal deadline she'd pushed past. Emails. 46 of them, ranging from professional queries to a message from her accountant about the joint account closure, to 2 from people she recognized as Grant's colleagues, carefully worded. The specific social agony of people trying to acknowledge something without taking a position. She deleted the ones from Grant's colleagues. She answered the professional ones with brief, factual notes. She called her accountant and spent 20 minutes reconstructing the financial picture of a life that had been deliberately dismantled and needed to be rebuilt from accurate figures rather than assumptions. The accountant, a careful woman named Deborah, who had been her father's accountant first and had the specific loyalty of someone who transferred their professional allegiance through generations, listened to the summary with the steady attention of someone running numbers in real time. "The joint account recovery will take 6 to 8 weeks through the fraud claim," Deborah said. "The credit cards are straightforward. Fraudulent closure, the issuer will restore your standing. The business accounts were separate, so your firm's finances are intact." A pause. "You're not as damaged as you probably feel." "I know," Nora said. "I know that." She did know it. The knowledge and the feeling were running on separate tracks, which was fine. They'd converge eventually. She spent the first week doing practical things, a locksmith, a new phone plan, a meeting with a divorce attorney, a woman named Claire Chen who had the precise, compassionate efficiency of someone who handled the administrative wreckage of ended marriages every day and understood that what people needed in those meetings was not sympathy, but clarity. Claire walked her through the process with the same methodical honesty that Reeves had used in the deposition, and Nora left the meeting understanding exactly what the next 18 months would require of her, and finding, to her mild surprise, that the prospect of those requirements didn't frighten her. They were just work. She knew how to work. The second week, she went back to her projects. The first thing she did was call the resort's interim management, a court-appointed administrator overseeing the property, while Meridian's receivership was unwound and the ownership structure was resolved. She introduced herself as the principal of Ellison Design Associates, described the firm's 23-year relationship with the property, and asked whether the restoration planning process had begun. The administrator, a tired-sounding man named Fournier, said it had not. He said the property was in a state of legal and physical suspension, damaged by the hurricane and frozen by litigation, and that no design work could proceed until the ownership question was resolved, which would take months. "When it's resolved," she said, "call me." "Ms. Ellison," he said carefully, "there will be a competitive bidding process for any design work. I'm not asking to bypass the process. I'm asking you to call me when it starts." She paused. "My father designed that building. I know it better than anyone alive. That's not sentiment. That's a professional qualification." Another pause. "And it's still standing." A silence. "Yes," Fournier said. "It is. Call me." She hung up. 3 weeks after the deposition, she received a letter. Physical mail, handwritten address, Chicago postmark. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, the same paper as the business card, and 3 sentences in handwriting she recognized from Carlo's letter in the storage unit, modified by a generation and a different life. The same architectural precision, every character formed as if it might be load-bearing. The regulatory matter is resolved. The Luxembourg connection has a name. When you're ready, there's a conversation worth having. No signature, just the initial D at the bottom, like a structural notation on a drawing. She read it twice, folded it, put it in the drawer of her desk where she kept the things that required more of her than she currently had, and that she intended to return to when she did. She returned to it 6 weeks later. Spring had arrived in Seattle in the way Seattle spring arrived. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in incremental degrees of light, the days lengthening and the gray softening by small amounts that accumulated until one morning you realized the quality of the air had changed, and you couldn't identify exactly when it had happened. She was having coffee at the kitchen table when she took the letter out of the drawer and read it again and called the number on the business card. He answered on the second ring. "I got your letter," she said. "I know." A pause. "How are you?" It was such a normal question that she sat with it for a moment, testing its weight, deciding whether it deserved a normal answer or an honest one. "Functional," she said. "Getting better at it." "That's something." "You said there's a conversation worth having." "I said when you're ready." "I'm calling." A brief silence. Not hesitation. Consideration. The difference being that hesitation was about doubt, and consideration was about respect for the weight of what was being said. "The Luxembourg entity has a principal," he said. "His name is Willem Kraus. He is 63 years old, a Belgian national, and he has been building this particular class of operation across coastal development markets for 20 years. The DOJ knows his name now. Reeves's team has been working the connection since Voss's files were fully analyzed. It's a matter of time." "That's not the conversation you meant." "No," he said. "It isn't." The coffee was cooling in her cup. Outside the kitchen window, the neighbor's cherry tree was beginning to show the first pale suggestion of blossom, weeks earlier than usual, confused by the season's ambiguity. "The resort," she said. "The ownership question resolves in 30 days. The court-appointed administrator will begin the restoration process. The property will need a lead designer for a comprehensive rehabilitation, structural assessment, interior redesign, environmental impact considerations for the rebuilt sections." He paused. "My family's stake, when formally dissolved, transfers to a conservation trust I established 3 months ago. The trust's mandate is coastal preservation and sustainable development consultation. Its first project will be the resort's restoration." "That's very tidy," she said. "Not accusatory, observational. The recognition of a man who had turned a liability into something he could live with, which was not the same as absolution, but was not nothing either. I'm aware of how it looks. It looks like you turned a problem into a purpose, she said. I'm not sure that's a criticism. A silence that had a different quality than the previous ones, something more open in it, less managed. The trust needs a creative director, he said. Someone who understands both the structural history of the property and the design intent of the original architect. Someone with the professional standing to lead a restoration that will be scrutinized by every environmental organization and architectural preservation body in the Caribbean. You're offering me a job. I'm describing a position that exists and that you are, by any objective measure, the most qualified person to fill. A pause. Whether you want to fill it is your decision. I have no leverage over it and no interest in creating any. She thought about what Lucia had said. Some of it is a cage he has not yet decided to leave. She thought about the 3 years he'd spent trying to unwind his family's hidden stake through an attorney who'd been feeding the information to his enemies. About the conservation trust established 3 months ago, before the deposition, before she'd laid everything on the table. Established when he'd still been carrying the problem alone, turning it into something he could justify without knowing whether he'd ever have the chance to tell anyone about it. She thought about her father, about a bolt installed quietly on the 9th floor of a tower, protection added without announcement because the building needed it regardless of whether anyone knew. She thought about the resort's ruined south wing and the clean, raw shoreline and the tower still standing on its cliff face, her father's work in the wind. It would need to be my vision, she said, not a restoration of the original design, a development of it, what my father would have done with 30 more years of practice, and the benefit of what we've learned about sustainable coastal building since he designed it. Yes, he said immediately, without qualification. I'd need full creative authority. No interference from the trust board on design decisions. Consultation on conservation parameters, yes. Interference on design, no. Agreed. And I'd need to meet the trust board before I committed to anything. Review the governance structure, understand who has oversight and what constraints that creates. I'll arrange it. She picked up her coffee. It was cold now, but she drank it anyway, because the gesture of doing something ordinary felt right in this particular moment. I'm not coming back to the Caribbean for a meeting, she said. The board can come here, or we can do it remotely. Chicago, he said. Halfway. She almost smiled. Fine. Chicago. Another silence. This one was different from all the others. Not loaded with information or strategy or the careful management of competing interests. Just two people on opposite ends of a phone line in different cities, having arrived at a place that neither of them had been heading toward, and that both of them, if they were honest, had been moving toward since a hurricane and a flooded corridor and a steel beam lifted from a woman's spine on the worst night of her life. Lucia sends her regards, he said. Tell her the sauce was the best thing I ate all week, possibly all month. She heard something in the background on his end, a sound that might have been a woman's voice responding to a relayed message with a sound that was distinctly not disapproval. She says you should come for dinner when you're in Chicago, he said. She'll make the real version. The real version. She says what you had was the storm version, made from what was available. The real version takes 3 hours and a specific cut of meat that she sources from a particular butcher in Bridgeport, and she doesn't make it for people who don't deserve it. Nora sat with this for a moment. The specific tenderness of it. The old woman in her Chicago kitchen deciding that a woman she'd known for 4 days in a hurricane deserved the real version of something she'd been making her whole life. Tell her I'll be there, she said. She ended the call. Set the phone face up on the table. Looked at the cherry tree outside the window, its blossoms opening slowly into the pale spring light. The divorce was finalized 11 weeks later. Claire Chen handled it with the same precise efficiency she'd promised, and the settlement was clean. The shared assets divided fairly, the joint accounts resolved, the legal architecture of 5 years of marriage dismantled with the methodical care of an engineer removing a structure that had served its purpose and needed to come down without damaging what was adjacent to it. Grant pled guilty to 2 counts of federal fraud 6 months after his arrest, the plea negotiated with the speed of a man whose attorney had already demonstrated its capacity for compromise. He received 4 years, reduced to 30 months with cooperation credit. Nora did not attend the sentencing. She was in the Caribbean by then, on site at the resort, walking the damaged south wing with a structural engineer and a conservation consultant and a clipboard full of questions. Simone Alcazar she did not contact, and Simone did not contact her. That silence was not unfinished. It was complete. A chapter sealed not with resolution, but with the understanding that some endings were not reconciliations, and that was fine. That the value of a friendship was not negated by its betrayal, but the friendship itself was. Nora had kept a few of the photographs from those years. She'd thrown away the ones that included Simone without ceremony, the way you removed a structural element that had failed. Not with anger, just with the recognition that it needed to go. The resort's restoration took 14 months from the first design meeting to the soft reopening. It was not a faithful reproduction of her father's original vision. It was something better, a development of it, as she'd said to Dominic on the phone that spring morning, built on the same structural philosophy, but evolved by 30 years of progress in materials science and environmental engineering and the accumulated understanding of what the coast actually needed rather than what a developer in the 80s had imagined it needed. She kept the tower exactly as her father had built it. The restoration team asked, twice, whether the observation tower should be updated, new glass, new cladding, contemporary materials. She said no both times, with the same flat certainty she used for structural decisions that weren't up for discussion. The tower stayed. The 9th floor bolt stayed. The whole building stayed exactly as Adrian Ellison had designed and modified it, because some things deserve to be preserved not because they were perfect, but because they were honest, and honesty in a building was rarer than any material. The Conservation Trust Board approved the final design package in a meeting in Chicago in October. Dominic was present as the trust chairman, seated at the far end of the table, and he asked 2 questions during the presentation, both technical, both relevant, neither designed to demonstrate authority, and voted yes with the rest of the board when the approval motion was called. Afterward, in the hallway outside the meeting room, he stood beside her while the board members collected their things and filtered out, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which had become, over the months of phone calls and site meetings and the occasional dinner at Lucia's table in Bridgeport, a comfortable condition between them. The ability to be quiet together was something Nora had come to value specifically, because it was the opposite of the life she'd had with Grant. That life had required constant performance, constant management of impression, the exhausting work of maintaining a version of herself that fit the version of the marriage they were supposed to be having. This was different. This was just 2 people who had been through something terrible and come out the other side and were figuring out, slowly and honestly, what the other side looked like. The board wants a naming consideration, he said, for the restored section. They'd like to name it after your father. She looked at him. The Ellison wing, if you're comfortable with it. She thought about her father, about the letter in a New Orleans hotel, about the bolt on the 9th floor, about the load-bearing elements of a life that had ended too soon and left its structures behind for other people to understand and continue, about a promise made between 2 imperfect men that had traveled 30 years through secrecy and silence and a hurricane and a federal investigation to arrive here, in this hallway, between their children. Yes, she said. I'm comfortable with it. He nodded, looked at his watch. Lucia's expecting us at 7. What's she making? She wouldn't say. She said if you had to ask, you didn't deserve to know. Nora laughed. It came out surprised, which was still the only way she laughed. Not because she was a person who didn't laugh, but because the ones that mattered still caught her off guard, still arrived before she'd decided to let them. They took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the Chicago evening. The lake was 2 blocks east, invisible but present in the quality of the air. That specific cold clarity that came off open water in autumn, clean and indifferent and enormous. The city moved around them with its ordinary, magnificent indifference. She had her coat and her bag and the project files under her arm, and the feeling of a woman who had lost almost everything and rebuilt from the foundation up, and was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately date, not bracing for the next thing. They walked. Not toward anything specific yet, just east toward the lake, because the water was there and the air off it was honest, and the light on it in October was the kind of light her father had tried to capture in his buildings, the quality of natural illumination that made stone and glass look like they were lit from inside. "My father would have liked you," she said. Dominic walked beside her, hands in his coat pockets, looking ahead at the street and the light and the distant glint of the water. He was quiet for a moment. That consideration, not hesitation. "I think he would have liked what you've done with his work," he said. "More than anything else." She thought about that, about the resort on its cliff above the Caribbean, the tower intact, the new south wing built in the honest spirit of the original, the Conservation Trust's first project completed, and the coastline preserved, and the whole thing standing the way good buildings stood, not because they were impervious, but because they were correctly built, load by load, element by element, with the understanding that strength was not the absence of vulnerability, but the intelligence of structure. The lake appeared at the end of the block, gray and luminous in the late afternoon light. They stopped at the crossing and waited for the signal, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. And the signal changed, and they crossed toward the water. And the wind came off the surface of the lake and moved through her hair, and it smelled like distance and clarity, and the particular freedom of things that had no shore on the other side. She didn't say anything, neither did he. They stood at the railing above the water and watched the light change on its surface, gold to copper to the flat, luminous gray that comes in the last 20 minutes before dark. And the city went on around them, and the water went on beyond them. And the story that had started on an island in a hurricane with a champagne flute shattering against a shell path ended here, in the ordinary, extraordinary quiet of two people standing at the edge of something vast and being, for the first time, unafraid of the depth.